Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. Both my friends on the screen, but also anyone who's joining us online. Today is Saturday, August 26, 2023, with another edition of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. As you can see, we're back home from Chicago from last week. Most of us are, so most of us are back in Philly. And of course, our colleagues Megna and Jahan are still in Chicago, and I think Eddie's still in Chicago as well. So just letting everyone know where we're located. Um, Today, we're going to mainly discuss why Biden must be defeated. So that will be by Dr. Anthony Montero. And then continuing off of last week, and especially the fantastic event honoring Reverend James Lawson, we had a discussion last week on Coretta Scott King, and we'll complete the discussion this week at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Doc, to talk about why Biden must be defeated.
Good. Yeah, thanks a lot, Emily, and good morning to everybody. I'd like to make this argument today. It's not the final statement on this. It might not be yet complete, but I think it is more than sufficient as an argument upon which we and the broad movement for democracy and peace can anchor itself. And I think it has to be said out loud at this time that Biden and the Biden administration must be defeated. That is the political and moral imperative of this time. Anyone who would support the re-election of Biden are on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of humanity. I don't think there's any other way to say it, and to say it any other way or not to say it would be an act of cowardice. And I look upon our saying this at this time to be in some ways following Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside for Time to Break Silence, where he said that silence is betrayal and cowardice. And so we have to speak. And I guess I'd like to just draw another phrase from that great speech that King gave, where he said, to oppose your own government in a time of war is a vocation of agony. And so you will be attacked. And what we now know from our study of the National Security Memorandum 46 a couple of weeks ago, that the deep state will do all that it can to destabilize and discredit all forces who go against the Biden administration. This has real ramifications for the what we call the triad of opposition, especially for Cornel West, who has not yet anchored himself politically. And he is going to have to do that if he is to be relevant in 2024. And by that, we're saying that he can't come up with a tactic of saying that I will only contest for the election in those states where it looks like Biden will what did they say? Where Biden is not being challenged. In other words, in those states, like swing states that are going to be contested, Cornel might say that he's going to withdraw from the election in those states, which is saying, in effect, that his tactic is to arouse the people in order to direct them to vote for Biden. My point is that The moral imperative and the political imperative for this moment is the defeat, and I would even use deeper language, the ignominious defeat of Biden. Now, before I get to the concrete aspects of the argument that I'm making, we have to say something about the free schools theory of social change and our worldview. It's very clear to us. We worked on this for so long and in so many different places and so on, that it's second nature to us. But to many people, it is not that clear. But in dealing with theory, or the theory of the free school, we also have to deal with another concept of variable, and that is the variable of probability. Even as we make the argument that we will make today, and even as we anchor it in the theory of the free school, we are still not dealing with absolute certainty. We are saying, in effect, that the probabilities are that the people will rise up in rebellion in 2024 against the Biden administration, which I will define more specifically later on, but that the people will rise up. That still there is not absolute certainty of outcomes, because the ruling class is still the ruling class or the ruling elite, and they control the state. So this juncture of theory and probability, theory does not give, and I just to make this clear, theory does not guarantee absolute certainty. Theory is a way to summarize a situation and to say, if things go in certain ways, if certain causes and effects operate, probably these outcomes will occur. Just on the theory of the free school, we have stated time and again that the foundations of free school theory and thinking are Du Bois, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin. We have elevated Du Boisian sociology to that level where we are saying that what he was doing in sociology has seldom, if ever, been done since him, and that is the study of the capacity of working people. That is Du Boisian sociology. He specifically was looking at Black folk, but it is apparent that the method can be applied way beyond just Black folk. The second foundation of the way we think is King's concept of the universal human. We talk about it all the time. Sometimes King expressed it in the idea that we're all wrapped in a single garment of destiny. His gesturing towards the idea that the divine is in every human being, and that every human being, because she or he is human, is similar in the most fundamental way. And finally, Baldwin's unique phenomenology, where he uses his unique phenomenology to study the US people. So in this respect, Baldwin does sociology as well as anyone does, but he does it through a lens of his phenomenology. In other words, the phenomenology of American people what American people think, say, and do, and how that is a way of studying what they are capable of. In each instance, be it Du Bois, King, or Baldwin, it imbues the theorizing and the theory of the free school with a high level of optimism and a sense of possibility. Well, saying that then explains what I'm going to say about the 2024 election. First of all, we should be clear. After Trump's election, probably before he was elected, the deep state went on high alert. By the deep state, we're of course talking about the national security state. We're talking about the major institutions of intelligence, destabilization, and infiltration. That is the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, and all of the many institutions connected to that, including the Justice Department and other departments of, quote, law and order. From the moment he was elected, the deep state put in place operations to undermine and destabilize him. It had never happened before. Impeachments, Russia collusion investigations, the use of all of the means of propaganda, such as cable news, the internet, social media, and so on, as propaganda instruments and means of the national security state. Donald Trump, from the very beginning, was seen as a threat, national security threat, in the same way that the 1978 National Security Memorandum looked upon the Black struggle as a national security threat. They saw that what Trump potentially represented in 2016 was, first of all, an outsider, but an outsider who, if successful, could spark or trigger a political realignment in the country, thus making the two major parties no longer the significant centers of elections and political mobilization. If that were true in 2016, it is more true today. A thing that I like to define is the whole concept of a regime and differentiate between the regime and the government. The regime is what is sometimes today called the deep state or the permanent government. The state is the permanent government. And I'm using the word government to mean governance, governing. The government is only and merely the, how would you say it? The appearance or the distortion of what is actually happening. In other words, we have a government which is not the final arbiter of rule and governance in the country. The permanent government. And in that regard, we're talking about at the federal level, all of the departments of government, all of the non-appointed parts of the government, including the court system and so on. We're talking about that army of bureaucrats, intellectuals, and operatives who run the government no matter who wins an election. In the case of the Biden administration, the appearance of governance and government, elected government, has more or less been discarded. The regime or the state is openly governing, whereas previously the government disguised or obscured who was actually running things. In the past, especially in the 1960s, when they felt that a high official like a president in the US government was going in an opposite direction to the state, the deep state or the permanent government, they could assassinate them. And that's all of the assassinations of the 1960s were part of that. Today it is more sophisticated. And we will see it, this new level of destabilization, disorganization, dividing, and so on of the people. A very sophisticated form of that will be executed in 2024. We're already seeing signs of it with the development of certain fake and organizations and so on, all in preparation for 2024. So I think we should keep that in mind, that what we see happening now, and in fact what we saw in 2020, because I'm now becoming increasingly convinced the election was stolen. You don't have to steal it in every state. You don't have to steal it in Texas or California or even New York, but in those battleground states. And in those battleground states, the margin, in all of them put together, the margin of victory for Biden was so narrow, and so many votes were mail-in ballots, and even in all of the states, it was acknowledged that they lost control of the voting process. That in fact, I would argue that 2020 was a stolen election. If it wasn't stolen, we definitely need an investigation to decide that. And 2024, 2020 had to be stolen because the deep state had to reassert its power over the governance of the country. Okay. Let me just I got 4 points that I want to make of why Trump should be defeated, or must be defeated, not just should.
Biden.
Biden, thank you. Biden must be defeated. And I'll start not from perhaps the most important reason, but I'll start from somewhere that seems ironic. For all of the progressives, especially the so-called progressives, quote unquote, who have chosen to fight from within the Democratic Party. I'm talking about like the Bernie Sanders, the AOCs, the DSA, the new mayor of Chicago, and so on. All of these forces that define themselves as progressive and socialist. A Biden victory will be the worst thing that could happen for them, because they will have to, with a Biden victory, accept their role as subordinates of the corporate wing of what they call the corporate wing of the Democratic Party and of the deep state. to the extent that they even have government power, they will be agents of the deep state, just like the corporate wing. And so therefore, a victory for Trump and the defeat of Biden will ironically serve the interests, as stated by the progressives, that they have. Their interest is in a defeat of Biden and a political realignment in the nation. And frankly, if a new left, a genuine left, a progressive and revolutionary left is to emerge, it cannot emerge except under conditions of a broad people's political realignment, and they're breaking with the Democratic Party as currently configured. This is the case also for the labor movement. The labor movement will continue to go into decline without a political realignment, and that political realignment cannot occur if Biden is reelected. The reelection of Biden would therefore put the regime, the deep state, in a stronger position of power. In fact, a second term for Biden would constitute clearly the institutionalization of an authoritarian dictatorship. The very thing which the deep state is attributing to the Trump movement, they themselves are implementing and will further consolidate if Biden is elected in 2024. If you are interested in democracy, the left, a progressive coalition, you can only hope for and fight for the defeat of Biden. Secondly, peace. This is a no-brainer. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science or political sophistication or whatever to understand that the Biden administration is the most warlike administration in the history of the United States. Let me underline that. The most warlike administration in the history of the United States. And I include the Nixon administration, I include the Johnson administration, I include the Bush administration, and on. If you take Ukraine and Russia, if you take Taiwan and China, if you take North Korea, if you take Niger and West Africa, the Biden administration is the most dangerous administration in terms of war and peace that we have ever seen in this country. But more than that, given its threats to use nuclear weapons, it might be the most dangerous administration or government in the history of the world. It is they who have threatened the use of nuclear weapons against China, against North Korea, and against Russia. In the face of a growing opposition, as manifested in the recent Brics conference in South Africa, where we now are talking about Brics +6, which will make Brics more significant than the G7, the so-called group of 7 advanced economies. That's their language. But here you have now the second largest, maybe the largest economy in the world, China, with Russia, with India, and on now with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and come on. This is a realignment on an international scale. And it is in its deepest meaning, since it includes now several African nations, Ethiopia and Egypt, along with South Africa. It establishes the foundation for a new realignment against neocolonialism. And as I think we said last week or the week before, the crisis of the ruling elite in this country, of the state, parallels the crisis of neocolonialism.
Yeah.
And Brics is the manifestation in institutional and organizational and state terms, interstate, international relations terms, of the crisis of the West and of its neocolonial policies. They want to talk about China and Africa. Well, what they fear about China and Africa is that China's role in Africa is anti-neocolonial. And that was the choice that the people made in Niger. Whether we will be slaves to French and American neocolonialism, or whether we will align with Russia and China against neocolonialism. And that goes for Ethiopia, which went through a very, very bloody civil war in the last couple of years, which the side trying to overthrow the Ethiopian government, the Tigrayans, were financed by the United States. That was defeated. Egypt's role as a major economy among the Arab and African Arab nations is highly significant. And of course, South Africa, and on and on. Third, democracy, civil rights, and civil liberties. There is no two ways about it. And they're saying it more openly now. You can read it in the New York Times on their op-ed pages. They say, well, we didn't say it editorially. Yeah, but you printed it. You don't print anything that I would write or anybody here would write. But you printed articles. The last one this past week said that, well, hey, elections might be the worst way to choose our leaders. So we can have, in the name of defending democracy, we will limit elections. Okay, you know what that's about. Looks like Trump is going to win. Let's outlaw elections. Okay. A week before that, also on the op-ed pages of the New York Times, by the way, the newspaper of record, which is their way of saying the state newspaper of the newspaper of the government of the state. A week before the article I just mentioned, there was another one that said that we have to, in the name of free speech, limit free speech. Okay. Now, what all that means in concrete terms, well, we'll have to see. But now the New York Times is coming out on the side of limiting democracy or elections to choose leaders and limiting free speech in order to protect free speech. Okay, but if that's not enough, this professor emeritus of Harvard Law School, a quote unquote specialist in constitutional law, and we're seeing this being repeated now, Lawrence Tribe, has said that Trump should be disqualified for running for president in 2024 under the 14th Amendment, and I think the second article of that amendment. The article against anyone who had involved him or herself in treasonous behavior should be disqualified for running for office. Now, as you know, we've had instances where Eugene Debs ran for president from prison. We've had other instances where people were indicted and still could run for president. But now Lawrence Tribe is saying that the 14th Amendment, by the way, the amendment that gave the right to vote and citizenship to the former slaves, that amendment should be used to disqualify Trump for running for president. If one is interested in democracy and civil rights and civil liberties, one has to be in favor of the defeat of the Biden administration. And then I guess finally I would say that this is the most critical moment in the political history of the United States, probably. It is an existential crisis for the ruling class. All of those people on the left who are taking up and advancing all sorts of issues to obscure the essential question for this time should be made aware that either you are a knowing operative of the deep state or a useful idiot of the deep state. There are no two ways about it. If your principal issue in 2024 is Cop City, you're either, knowingly obscuring the real essence of what the struggle is, or you're just too dumb to understand what things are. The Democratic Party is not the party of liberals and progressives. It is the party of the deep state and of the military-industrial complex, as well as the what we call the billionaire class and the financial oligarchy. That's what the Democratic Party is. Now, if you're in that party, you say, well, I'm not any of that. Well, you're just one of the followers of that. The fact of the matter is, however, the working class is leaving the Democratic Party in droves. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. And now, first of all, the majority of the working class is no longer in the Democratic Party. Good part of them in the Republican Party, but the biggest part of the working class is in the Trump movement. And that's what we have to see it as. And now, we saw it and we talked about this in the Philadelphia primary for mayor in May. We've seen it in Chicago. Black people are no longer listening to the Black political class. And working people are no longer listening to the leaders of the AFL and CIO. Black folk, the last real constituency, reliable constituency of the Democratic Party, are leaving it. And they're leaving it in anger and bitterness because of the betrayal of Black people by the Black political class. We saw something of this in Atlanta just a couple of days ago, and somebody captured it on video, where the Trump motorcade was going through what has to be one of the poorest sections of Atlanta, which of course is majority Black, overwhelmingly Black. That part of Atlanta is so poor, they don't even have sidewalks. The people are walking on dirt roads. You know, something that if you didn't go to those parts of the South that are poor like that, you would never know that people are living in communities where there are no sidewalks. So these were poor Black people. When the Trump motorcade rolled through that area, all of these Black people were shouting, "Free Trump, free Trump." So a lot of people say, well, that was staged. The majority of Black people in Atlanta don't agree with that. Well, first of all, we don't know what the majority of Black people agree with or don't agree with, because they're not honest with politicians or pollsters. I mean, being Black myself, I can tell you that, you know? And then Black people always feel they're being spied on by the politicians and so on. They ain't gonna tell you what they think. But that was a demonstration unlike anything we have seen since the rise of Trump. That demonstration, or other demonstrations like that, might go viral across this country. A realignment from the bottom up. A new people, a new politics, a new progressive movement, a new left is about to be born. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think this is an important moment for free school to say this unequivocally, because it's something that we've been getting at, but I think we're reaching a point in the crisis in this country, in a point where we need to say why Biden must be defeated, but also to make the point that if you consider yourself a progressive, this is the political path that you must also be on too. And yeah, and I think I also underlined in my notes when you were talking, Doc, the political but also moral imperative to defeat Biden. And I feel like that is important, because when I also saw the video that you're pointing out of when Trump's motorcade was going through Atlanta, I literally thought it was rural Georgia. Like I told you, because it looked rural, but that was urban. But then I checked the facts, and it was actually an urban area of Atlanta. And this is not just a political imperative, but it's moral, because how can you look at that video, and this is not just that specific community in Atlanta, but that's actually a reflection of how most people in America are, like the state of the crisis, the poverty people experience. And it's something I was watching the Tucker Carlson interview with Donald Trump. Something Trump says, which I think is significant, is he also said, first of all, I think you had mentioned this, Doc, but Tucker Carlson twice asked Trump, it's both Tucker Carlson asking Trump, do you think they will try to kill you? Do you think the deep state, the permanent, not just the facade of a government, but the permanent government, the regime, the deep state, do you think they will try to kill you because they're going to these extents to indict you? But also, is Tucker Carlson saying, it wasn't a question, it was Tucker Carlson the second time he asked it, he said, yeah, we all know they're going to try to kill you because they're going to these extents to indict you. And Trump said, when Trump kind of avoids answering it, like yes or no, but what Trump does say, which I think is significant, relates to the video in Atlanta where ordinary Black people are yelling "Free Trump" and saying that they are not against Trump, but in fact support him, and if anything, see themselves as part of a greater political rebellion that Trump knowingly is placing himself in and takes leadership and ownership of. But Trump said, he told Tucker Carlson, I think most people underestimate how smart the American people are. He made that point. And what he was saying was, he was speaking to those Black people in the video, saying, the American people, from those Black people in Atlanta who are cheering the motorcade on, to like even the white workers who, like you said, Doc, to the white workers and other workers who have already left the Democratic Party, who not just consider themselves independent, but are moving in a certain direction and do not trust the AFL-CIO. Trump is speaking to those people. And it shows a certain clarity Trump also has of the political rebellion that is emerging, like the greatest political rebellion that this country has seen, and that Trump himself also knows the potential cost of what it means. And like, I think that's also, it adds depth to something he said at his campaign kickoff. I forget when it was, where Trump outright said, I am your retribution. Like he said, I take responsibility for you. Like I am your retribution. Or when he says, when they indict me, when the deep state indicts me, they're really indicting you, the American people. They're saying you do not deserve like a government that reflects you. It's a punishment of you. And in some ways, I do kind of read it as Trump is like, I'm being punished, but the ultimate crime is that it's not really about me. It's a crime against the people. And so that's why I think it's really significant for free school at this point where like we're approaching 1 year out from the election. The 2024 election is already here. And we're reaching a point where, like, I think the other point you made, Doc, that was significant is it's a question of political realignment. The world is already realigning. The question is now, in America, what is the political realignment here? And if you are progressive or even consider yourselves a revolutionary, whatever that means today for people, you have to ask yourself, like, how do you understand political realignment as something not just radical, but revolutionary? Because Biden, like you said, a victory of Biden puts the deep state, the regime, the permanent government behind everything in a position of power. And that puts in more power, and that puts the American people at, like, you have to ask, at what position does that put the American people? When the American people at this point are already in a position of weak, the American people themselves have been like, have suffered from deindustrialization, so much that we've talked about, poverty, war. But what position are you then putting the American people? And it is only a Trump victory that clears the path for a political realignment that a current political rebellion is shaking towards. And I thought it was really clarifying, Doctor, also the way you described that a Trump victory and a political realignment makes the two parties irrelevant. And when you make the two parties irrelevant, what that also does is it almost like, to make the two parties irrelevant also puts the people in power. Like, at least that's how I'm viewing it. It also, like, when you can make those two parties irrelevant, it clears the path for the people. And I guess I'll talk about it later with Coretta Scott King, but it actually does remind me of strategically and tactically how King, Coretta, and the SCLC were interpreting the Poor People's Campaign. Like this thing of, what does it mean that we have things like the departments of labor, interior, like security, all that stuff? What would it mean for the people to essentially become, in essence, be the ones who operate the departments. Yeah. So anyways, I guess I'll stop there, but I think it was really clarifying, and I don't want to talk too much, which is why I want to stop here. But the other thing I did want to, this is a little different, but it's related, is what you said, Doc, about let us clarify also free school having a clear position that Biden must be defeated. Let us also be clear on free school's foundations, like our foundations of Du Bois, King, and Baldwin. And I think that was very important for us to clarify for ourselves, but to other people, is that to ground ourselves in Du Bois, King, and Baldwin. And you so beautifully described like Du Bois sociology, which is not academic sociology, but rather a study of the capacity of the people.
Yeah.
A sociology that perhaps has not even been done since Du Bois. King, the universal human, Baldwin, the phenomenology, and in some way sociology, that this is all free school. We ground ourselves in the way we assess, understand, and think about the future. It's grounded in a high level of optimism and
Yes.
a belief in the possibility and capacity of the people. But yeah, I just want to stop there so other people can talk.
Can I just ask a question, Emily? Just, I hate to interrupt, but I've texted you about this, and it's something that I have gotten from your mother's observation at least a year and a half ago. She assessed the situation in the country, and I think this is very important, not as a cold civil war so much as a pre-revolutionary situation. And if you recall, and I completely agree with your mother. And by I guess we're going to have to define what we mean by revolution. We're not talking about something wild and extreme and something that somebody learned by looking at a movie about revolution. We're talking about a democratic process.
Right.
But can I ask you this in a text? And I would be very interested. I know clearly the concept of pre-revolution, your mother learned in her school days in China, but what led her to that observation? Do you have any idea?
No, I should have asked her before free school today. I'm sorry, I should have. But this is also a reminder that I do need to call my parents because I haven't called them in a while. But maybe if my mom's watching, she can also text me because she watches the first hour of free school every week because she likes to see my face. So I need to. So maybe if she's watching, she can text me. But I don't know. It's interesting because I don't know. My mom in particular would pull out words like that, pre-revolutionary words I don't even understand the meaning of. And so I don't completely even know what she means by pre-revolutionary. But I do remember that she used the term because we were reading a New York Times article together last year. It was published in July of 2022 by David Brooks. It was that article called, like, the title, I remember we talked about it in free school, and it was a deep article because it was basically an article where David Brooks says we're at a point in US history where there's such a political rebellion that we don't even have the categories to understand it. It's where he said that. I don't know if you guys remember that article. It was called A 2024 Presidential Candidate Who Meets the Moment. And he was talking about Trump. And I remember my mom and I were reading that op-ed by David Brooks. And it was after I was reading it out loud to her where she said, yeah, you could say that America is at a pre-revolutionary period. And I should clarify to her what she means by that. But just a vague guess is that I think she felt or she saw what we see, which is that there is no such thing as a center anymore. Because the thing that I remember the thing she completely agreed with and that she felt like someone was saying for the first time was when David Brooks gave the statistic that most Americans do not see themselves as part of any of the parties. That for the first time, like, it's almost like there's such a rebellion that the American people are making moves on their own. They do not follow an existing leadership, like the way you described it, Doc, as the Black worker does not follow the Black political leadership anymore. Working class does not follow the labor leadership, like the AFL-CIO anymore. What does it mean when the center cannot hold. I think that's what made my mom feel like, oh, it's a pre-revolutionary period. But I should ask her.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it was just a joke, sorry. But my mom, she sometimes uses the words like petty bourgeoisie versus bourgeoisie. Like she taught Alice the Chinese word for petty bourgeoisie. It's kind of interesting, the education that my parents got in China. And I'm like, oh, it's actually very useful. It's a useful education that you got in China in the 60s and 70s, because like it's a very useful language. Like it's not even just the language, but it's useful when you have an understanding of even of just like a framework of revolution, like a revolutionary process. I was like, oh yeah, like my parents actually have a very useful framework that they could help me with to even understand America. And I guess I just wanted to underline that when I re-upped what you said, Doc, about free schools foundations and Du Bois, King, and Baldwin, that in defining revolution, it's also related to what you were saying in your intro, Doc, about that free school we are starting to, and I think it's very important that we define our understanding of social change. Yeah, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I think what you had laid out, Doc, in the beginning, or also in previous weeks, of this parallel where in the United States, the ruling elite cannot rule, and also the crisis of neocolonialism in the world is extremely significant. Because I think on one hand, we're building up to the election, but it's also beyond the election as well, where it's through the election that the American people are being educated and their level of consciousness is also rising. And you see that through like the figures of Trump and RFK Jr., where I know like for both of them, they recently had interviews with Tucker Carlson and were able to have a platform where they could speak about what they stood for and why they believed what they believed. And even the discussion around Trump, in addition to what he had said, two things stood out. Actually, it's just one thing, but split into two, which is that you can see the evolution of Trump as well. Because when he said, I didn't like what Emily said of like how the American people are smarter than he thought, meaning when he started all this out, he wasn't where he is right now. And when he said the American people are a lot smarter, he's saying like, despite all the indictments coming at him, every time his poll numbers just increase, because there's a distrust the American people have of the government, or not of the government, but of the regime that they see is attacking Trump and what he stands for. And on the other hand as well, is his acknowledgement that when he first started in 2016, he did not understand and still doesn't completely understand the deep state, where Tucker asked him this question: did you know everything that was going on at the CIA or FBI? And he was like, no.
Yeah.
But there's one thing I do know, and this was around Soleimani. And with that, it's actually very connected to RFK's platform as well, and what we have characterized as the triad opposition, where with RFK Jr., in his interview with Trump, he's very explicit about actually the role of the CIA and the FBI, and specifically in the perpetuation of the war in Ukraine, and also of all the coups that have come in the years since the end of World War II and with the Cold War. Like he openly states like the US has been involved in, I think it was like 40 plus or 60 plus coups throughout the world. And that is extremely dangerous for both Trump and RFK Jr., because something that Tucker raises in both interviews is, do you think they're going, like essentially, do you think they will try to kill you? Because, and this is more explicit in the interview with RFK Jr., because they talk about how he's been denied Secret Service, which is something that is abnormal for any presidential candidate, essentially, especially from when his father was assassinated, how all presidential candidates after RFK had been given Secret Service. And so that led to their discussion of, will they try to kill RFK Jr.? And also in this Trump interview wasn't elaborated on explicitly, but also this idea of what Doc, you were saying earlier, which is when a president is against the deep state or has signs of going against the deep state, how does it respond? But I think that's very much the piece that we're also seeing on like the ruling elite in this country. But then I know a lot of us are following the BRICS summit very closely, and the world is going through extreme changes, and like more so than actually in the previous years that we've been talking about. And when you say the crisis of neocolonialism, I think that's also what we're trying to understand in the free school, because some states, or not some states, some individuals, groups, the narrative out there can also be positioned that, oh, what Russia, China, BRICS represent is the same as the US and the West, meaning it's all just these blocks and centers of power with these smaller states revolving around them. But then if you're going to make that position, you have to explain what neocolonialism is. And, you know, for many of us, we're trying to study Nkrumah and what he's written about neocolonialism as the highest stage of colonialism and of imperialism. But, and, you know, I know Emily and Doc, you've been having conversations of how that's also very in line with what Winston was saying in Strategy for a Black Agenda. And, you know, in assessment or in assessing or looking at BRICS, there are major like themes that have come out. And one of the biggest ones is the development of Africa, where she was talking about this global development initiative to develop many of these countries that have been underdeveloped, under-industrialized. And so, and I specifically point to the industrialization piece because this is a huge center of focus of Nkrumah's neocolonialism, where he talks about how Africa has been intentionally kept deindustrialized so that they never really have the power or like the negotiating power for the commodities or primary goods that Western countries import over time. But that's, or I guess specifically speaking to, you see that is one of the criteria where in these relationships with Africa and also the Middle East, et cetera, they're trying to raise the living of standards through both agriculture and industry. And then the other piece is also, like, I think many people have been talking about a like new currency that might emerge out of this BRICS formation and what that means. And I think we're all still trying to figure out like what is money, what's currency, like all this stuff. But what I do get, or what we've at least gotten a sense of, is what has the American dollar been built off of, and how Saudi Arabia and these countries, Iran, the UAE, are so important to upholding the American dollar because it's tied to oil and gas. But then what does it mean now that these countries are now part of BRICS and are part of the conversation and talking about a new currency? Like, that is terrible for the position of the United States or the ruling elite in this country. And so I think there's a lot to understand. But what we do know, and what Docky said was really important, which is what is the essence of the struggle? Because I think there are many distractions here. Like, either it's like actually intentionally being distracted or chasing the wrong tails, or you're just stupid and following the wrong things. Then in that case, like, there is a new political alignment that needs to happen, where people have to understand, okay, what side of history do you stand on? And what is the main task to understand for this time? And it is a matter of war and peace. It is a matter of who the ruling elite in this country are and what is it that they are standing for. But it's really exciting. And I think we're both exciting and also scary, because, you know, I think we've had conversations where, Doc, you've also said this, which is that for us, like young people in this country, it is a time of uncertainty where you don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years, like not even just 10, 20 years, but the next couple of years. And But that also points to an enormous task for all of us. That's why sometimes it feels so scary, because of the enormity of the task. But in those times, I'm grateful for the free school, but that's another story to tell.
I just wanted to say that, well, I think this point is very important that I took away from the opening, which is in some ways we are inverting where the left has imposed an anti-Trump litmus test on who is progressive and liberals. We're saying it's the opposite. The real litmus test is, are you anti-Biden? And that's, as was discussed, the moral and political imperative. And I mean, I think this point also we can't say enough. This is the most warlike administration, because I think part of the ways in which the elite has, pervade ignorance upon people means that people are not able to see the Biden regime in the context of history, and do not see the dangers. Like, we are literally living in the most dangerous time since World War II. There was never a moment in the entire Cold War, as far as anyone can correct me, where we were this close to nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And so there is no question this has to be the number one thing, the defeat of Biden. And I think the thing we've been discussing, that the American people are so far ahead of the left. I mean, I really thought the Atlanta videos were beautiful, and just hearing the voices of the discontented, I thought was a beautiful thing. And I remember speaking with the late Glenn Ford about gentrification, and he said that, I think from what I recall, he was saying that Atlanta may be the most vicious example because it was done pretty much by an entirely Black political class that had progressive credentials, even people coming out of the civil rights movement and so on. And so in Atlanta, from what I remember him saying, you have a horrible, basically, class inequality among the Black community. And you see that with the state. I mean, I think you have some of the wealthiest Black people. They call it the Black Mecca, and who own sports teams, entertainment, and so on. And then you have the neighborhoods that we saw in that video. And so it's no surprise that there's going to be a collapse of support among the Black masses for the Democratic Party, because it's been such a vicious betrayal over the past 40 years in places like Atlanta. And of course, those people have a great amount of capacity, because those are literally the people who are the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement and so on. And the other thing is, I mean, yeah, this question of the future of our democracy, again, inverting it, because the ruling elite is trying to say the future of our democracy is under threat from Trump, from Russia and China. But the real question is facing the American people is, will we protect our democracy from the deep state? Will we struggle for a new kind of democracy in line with how the world is trying to democratize itself? And in the context of all that, you have to take Trump seriously. You have to take the anti-Trump persecution. In a lot of ways, the equivalent, I think we could argue, of the old McCarthyism is this kind of anti-Trump thing. We're just trying to target everyone, including us, as part of a red-brown alliance and so on. And it's very impressive, the American people not listening to all this. And so other two examples besides what we saw in Atlanta, one, I mean, which was discussed, the Trump interview. It's important to say that Trump's interview with Tucker, Trump boycotted the presidential debate on Fox News and did the interview with Tucker, and it basically took the entire steam out of the Republican presidential debate in Milwaukee. And from what I was just looking, the Trump interview is the most watched interview in history. It has some like close to 300 million views, which is like almost the entire population of the United States. I think the United States is like 330 million. So, I mean, of course, there's people around the world watching it, but it's just basically, I think this is the death knell of the mainstream media. I mean, they used to basically, they were gatekeepers and like, oh, we are going to interview presidents and presidential candidates. Now they're all on X and Tucker. And so it seems to be the death of the corporate media. And then at the same time, RFK did an interview with someone else that he published on X, the new name for Twitter, and in which he said that the CIA, going back to the 60s, has become the biggest funder of journalism in the world. Going back to I forget what it's called, some operation they did where they were paying off journalists, and now it's become an international thing. And I think the masses are realizing that the corporate media, the legacy media is basically the deep state media. And so it's very significant what people like Tucker and other independent journalists now, Glenn Greenwald and others are doing. And it's just a very impressive thing. So, and of course, you know, in the midst of all that, the Brics summit is very important. Now I think it's about 11 nations, including the other significant thing is I think they're 6, I think, of the 9 largest oil producing nations, who I believe produce over 50%, I think about 80% of the oil, which is the death of the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia, Iran. The big surprise for me was United Arab Emirates, which I wasn't expecting. And of course, Egypt. And then, as Doc had discussed, the major African nations, some major African nations, including Ethiopia, which is the second most populous nation in Africa, and South Africa, which I believe is the most industrialized so far nation in Africa, and Egypt, which is obviously an oil producer and has a historic role in the non-aligned movement and so on. So it's a very significant times, but it all comes back, I think, for us to the American people. And Jeremiah was telling me yesterday that figures like Gerald Horne are saying that we need to stop discussing the politics in America, focus on what's happening in the world with Brics and so on. But you see with Richard Haas, the opposite. The real threat is the American people, because if the American people are confronting the deep state, then they won't have the tools to stop the rise of Brics and the rise of a movement towards global democracy. So I think that remains the historical task. And embracing anti-Trumpism is going to be an obstacle. And the anti-Biden movement is basically what can unite a majority of the people for this political realignment.
Yeah. You know, this thing about the CIA being the biggest funder of journalism in the world, you really see it with all the coverage of Brics leading up to it. It was all, they're not going to expand. India doesn't want anyone in, and South Africa, they're too aligned with the West, and, you know, anonymous sources and everything. And I mean, the outcome was just the opposite. You have this huge expansion, including of Iran, and that is so powerful because they don't have to live in fear of these sanctions anymore. They can pursue their policy, which they were already doing, but they don't have that chokehold of sanctions with Brics, with an alternative form of financing. And then India-China peace happening. That wasn't supposed to happen according to all the coverage and just all this negativity and just, you know, this is a meaningless acronym. And it's just so clear the outcome is so divergent from what's actually happening. And the other thing I was just going to say in relation to what people have been saying about the new left progressive movement, what you ended with, Doc. I don't know if you saw that video by that young man, Oliver Anthony. The song, Richmond, north of Richmond. Yeah. But also the reaction to that has been so interesting because people called it right wing. People called it racist somehow. But if you actually listen to the lyrics, what he's saying is so deep. He's saying this country puts young men 6 feet under, you know, without giving them a chance. It takes away their lives, you know, and the way he's speaking, Richmond, north of Richmond, it's just the whatever comes will be so organically coming from that suffering and those feelings of pain and that hope for a better world. And it's really the opposite of what people are calling. Anybody who's saying something, anybody who's making this condemnation is completely on the side of the elites. And yeah, just that thing you were saying, Doc, the regime versus the government. I mean, Baldwin's mirror. I mean, that is what Baldwin's mirror is. To see the regime and the government, to not be able to differentiate, to think that this is a government by the people. But all of that is really cracking now, as we've all been discussing. So yeah, a lot to think about today.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I'm really excited about today's discussion because, I mean, it's like many, as Emily said, it's like many things that we've talked about, you know, but in some ways it's like coming into fruition and being solidified. But I just wanted to say, I really appreciate, I think, Doc, the way that you started with talking about where does the free school base itself in, and just clarifying, we base ourselves in Du Bois' sociology, which is a new type of sociology that had never been seen before and has yet to be fully understood and explored and developed, we base ourselves in King's idea of the universality of humanity, and then in Baldwin's phenomenology. And I just feel like it's important to frame it that way and frame the way that we understand the 2024 election, because I think one of the other things that you've said in the past is that humanity, and that includes the American people, but humanity has reached a point where the ruling class can no longer just use these blunt instruments of repression against the people. They have to become more ideologically sophisticated and actually try to justify their rule, or to use other methods in order to maintain their rule. And part of that, I think, is that if we look at the crisis of, first of all, American society, and then the world crisis as well, it's that in a moment of crisis, the people are going to be looking for, like new ideas, new ways of thinking, which will lead them towards the future and will lead them out of the crisis. And as part of that, like our sense of the people is that they will go looking for a figure like Du Bois. They will go looking for a Martin Luther King and a Baldwin. And so what does the ruling class have to do in that situation is they have to try to get ahead of it and try to be like, oh no, like this is what a Du Bois means. This is what a Baldwin means. This is what a King means, right? And I feel like they've done that the most with Martin Luther King. But, with Du Bois, up until now, the ruling class had tried to just bluntly suppress the memory of Du Bois. But now they have to try to be like, oh no, they have to try to reappropriate Du Bois and be like, oh, this is actually the meaning of Du Boisian sociology. And they try to put him in a box in a corner, and in a way that Du Bois would not be able to be used by the people in a revolutionary sense. And they want to try to basically distort the memory of Du Bois, because it's interestingly the ruling class that in some ways recognizes the revolutionary essence and significance of these figures. And so they want to try to get ahead of it and try to distort them, because they know that the people will go looking for these types of figures in order to guide them. And I think I just wanted to bring that up also, because something else that I appreciate that you have framed and discussed before is that this notion of the political crisis of American history right now is a crisis that's being pushed from below. It's being pushed by the people. And this is something that needs to be really understood, because it's I don't know. I think one of the questions that I've had for the past couple months is almost how would actually a transformation of, whether you call it state power, a transfer of power, also referring back to theories of the state, like Lenin's state and revolution, how would actually revolutionary transformation take place? Because you have to address this question of the state. And I think that one of the interesting ways that I've thought about it in the past is essentially one of these unique phenomena in American history, whether it's the Reconstruction period or the Civil Rights period, is when you have essentially a people's movement or the people's self-activity and self-organization. When you have a people's movement, even if it's not in the direct sense, maybe directly attacking the federal government, right? In the way that you might say is the more conventional notion of a revolution, whatever, what a people's movement is able to do, if it's able to develop and to find its sense of direction and motion and to actually move forward, is that you have this, it's almost like a political landscape in which the existing institutions of the state and of the ruling class have to, it's like the people are bending, they're bending society, they're bending also the political landscape, and ultimately they're bending these institutions of the ruling elite, and they bend it to the point of breaking them. And I feel like Trump is, in some ways, it's a manifestation of because I don't know, one of the questions that I'm interested in is, let's say if Trump is able to either successfully make it into the presidency or even otherwise, how will a people's movement that is coalesced around, whether it's Trump, RFK, even Cornel West, what will it actually mean for the existing institutions of the state and of the ruling elite, this permanent state? And I think it's not even so much about directly going to I don't know, maybe even confront them in a sense, but it's more a people's movement that can it's you're bending the institutions of the state to the point of breaking them. And I don't know, I was just thinking about that, because it's also King's notion of the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I don't know, I was just thinking about it in that sense. Like it's almost like a sense of like how would you do with sociology or political, like a political science of like the gravitational weight of a people's movement, and what that actually does to destabilize but also to change the existing political institutions that govern society. And I think the last thing I want to say is that part of what a crisis means, and I think it was Raju who had first said this before in a reading group, but that like what a crisis means is an opening. And what an opening means is another way of saying that we're in the most profound crisis in America's history is that we are in the moment of the greatest possibility in America's history. And I think that whether it's addressed to the left or anyone else, it's like in the free school, we're not afraid to look directly at, it's almost like if you, I don't know, sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place, but it's like we're not afraid to look directly at the heart of what's happening. And there are many people who are afraid to look at it because it's like it has consequences also for how you see yourself and the role that you understand in your society, and also this question of like what side of history are you on. And I think that like, sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but that like in a moment where there's basically a profound crisis, we're not afraid to look at essentially where's the greatest area of possibility and how can we see ourselves in relation to that. And I think many on the left will basically either not look at this question, or they'll try to basically like hide away from it, or to not really be honest in how they relate to it. And yeah, basically it's like you're consigning yourself to the dustbin of history along with the ruling class. But yeah, I just wanted to bring those things into question, especially this question of like, what will a people's movement actually mean for the ruling class, but also for the institutions of state power? Because I think this is something that's also still in motion, and we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But yeah.
Yeah, I want to add to what Jeremiah was saying, because I was thinking about this even when I was listening to the Trump interview with Tucker Carlson. I got this feeling, and we've talked about this before, but with these indictments and also Tucker sort of insisting that the logical next step is probably them trying to assassinate you. Uh, all of this, I think the ruling class, by doing this, they've inadvertently put Trump square in the history that includes JFK and and King, for that matter. He's been tied to that history in a way that's very, now it's not going to be, people are not going to be able to unsee it. And in this context, I was also thinking of King. There was this article in New York Times I saw today, which talks about the March on Washington, and he says that this changed America. But then what it goes on to do is basically tear down King, because the claim that they're trying to make through that article is actually King wasn't the center of this march. It was actually Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, and King was just a really small part. And it was actually all of this. And then it went on to basically talk about how Bayard Rustin has been vilified and not given the credit he deserves and all of that. But this is part of a campaign, I think, which is gathering momentum in these times to further erase King from people's memory and attack him and trivialize him. And I think the attack on King is qualitatively different from the attack on Du Bois, because in some ways it's hard to misappropriate King. It's hard to, because he had a message that was so simple and so truthful that I think it's, I don't know, I mean, this, I could be wrong about this, but I think it's harder to misappropriate King the way they're trying to do with Du Bois and Baldwin, for instance. And I expect these attacks to get even more vicious in the months leading up to the election, especially because of how the Trump movement has re-invoked the spirit of the civil rights movement, at least in the sort of, in the, I mean, in the sense of a people's movement once again from bottom up emerging. And if you think about what we talked about, the Rage Against the War Machine rally, it's starting at the Lincoln Memorial. Scott Ritter's speech that he didn't deliver but he published, actually invoking King's message when he spoke there. All of this just confirms and explains this renewed attack on King that I'm seeing everywhere nowadays. And I just wanted to, if it's okay, read out one small part from Baldwin's essay talking about the dangerous road in front of Martin Luther King Jr. that I was thinking about when we were having this discussion. And he's talking about seeing King at uh, Ebenezer Baptist Church preaching for the first time there. And he says, um, until Montgomery, the Negro Church, which has always been the place where protest and condemnation could be most vividly articulated, also operated as a kind of sanctuary. The minister who spoke could not hope to effect any objective change in the lives of its hearers, and the people did not expect him to. All they came to find and all that he could give them was the sustenance for another day's journey. Now, King could certainly give his congregation that, but he could also give them something more than that, and he had. It is true that it was they who had begun the struggle, of which he was now the symbol and the leader. It is true that it had taken all of their insistence to overcome in him a grave reluctance to stand where he now stood. But it is also true, and it does not happen often, that once he had accepted the place they had prepared for him, their struggle became absolutely indistinguishable from his own and took over and controlled his life. He suffered with them, and thus he helped them to suffer. The joy which filled this church, therefore, was the joy achieved by people who have ceased to delude themselves about an intolerable situation, who have found their prayers for a leader miraculously answered, and who now know that they can change the situation if they will. And of course, I mean, I know there is a long road from
Hold
Trump.
on. Hold
Yeah.
on. Where's that essay? What essay is that?
The dangerous. Yeah, this is the essay called "The Dangerous Road" before Martin Luther King Jr. I think he writes this in 1960. Um, and anyway, I mean, I was trying to sort of connect this to what we are discussing today. I mean, there's of course a long road between Trump to King, and what's happening now to completely sort of tap into the spirit and the consciousness of the civil rights movement. But even in the interview, when Trump says something like, I have never seen a spirit in the people like I see today, when he says that, and when you watch those videos from the Atlanta, those groups who are waiting for Trump to go down and saying free Trump or whatever, I mean, it's almost like it's I think ironical that I think Trump has sort of been squarely put into this history, whether he intended to or not. And I mean, there's no going back from this. He is part of a movement now. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, kind of meditating on everything that you guys are saying and processing it. On the way over to Doc's house, I was thinking, like, why? I guess I understand that why James Lawson wrote his Revolutionary Nonviolence, because he was the architect of understanding it, or one of many men who have took the responsibility to teach it. But, and I also understand to a certain extent why Coretta King wrote her autobiography at the time that she did, which was to say that, or it was to say for certainty that the struggle is incomplete, and there's still things to be done. And like, as I've been brainstorming what like the Du Bois Collective should like read and stuff, I think Medgar Evers' wife, as clarified by Doc, he told me, wrote an autobiography which also would illustrate Medgar Evers' life. And I have to look more into if Diane Nash has a biography or autobiography. But I wonder why she didn't also write anything to theorize on nonviolence. Because I feel like I trust her to have something to say about it. And the way that she played a role as one of the foremost students in Nashville to desegregate the lunch counters. And I think a similar, like, I can imagine, like, if I was a woman who was married to one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, why it would make sense to write an autobiography to illustrate what led me to a certain point in history and leave behind instructions as best as I could. But for Coretta, her choosing to do an autobiography isn't just a tactic to be copied, but she had a particular responsibility in writing it. And I'm thinking about how the nonviolent struggle was a struggle that wasn't completely finished. As the movement had moved toward the Poor People's March and had aligned to the decision that King had made about Vietnam. Because my other question was like, what was the role of the deep state before Martin Luther King Jr.? Throughout Coretta's autobiography, she also notes the relationship that the movement had to the federal government and how they trusted the federal government. And I think it was a decision in Atlanta or something where they didn't march. I might be getting this wrong, but the choice was because they couldn't go against the federal government because they had done the Supreme Court decision in 1959, or like whatever, the Supreme Court decision to the Brown v. Board, I think, or whatever it was. So they, or like that to me tells me that the civil rights and freedom struggles led by Martin Luther King Jr. was the conscience of the country, was the heart of the American people, which is what you're saying, Purva. The spirit of the civil rights movement, the people's movement, is the King movement, is the nonviolent struggle that has yet to also be completed because of its development towards the struggle against war and the development of the American people's economic and moral capacity. So the deep state and the FBI apparatus that Doc, you're also illustrating in your introduction, had to have occurred after they assassinated King, after they had a number of assassinations, which, while reading Coretta's autobiography, it's interesting the way that she thought about each assassination, where it wasn't because, Coretta and King had like a debate, or like they disagreed that, what was the word? Destiny. It wasn't like a question of destiny or that there was a particular plan written out, but that they were doing God's will. And like that clarified to me the point that the Nation of Islam is making and the point of the fact that, or like the point of God being within, or that, because and that's only important only in regards to this whole question about the American people and the capacity of the American people, which is another thing that I wanted to come back to. But just saying that, so what it seems to me is that one of the struggles, or one of the clearer things in my mind, is how the struggle against the deep state will happen, and how much that has to do with the consciousness of the American people, and the ideological struggle. Meaning, like, what is the deep state used for? If not for the entire, like, whatever right word is to use, degradation of the human being,
Right.
To commit war against the American people, trick, to tell people lies, and have people act out against almost their own free will. And so, like, as regards to what you mentioned about the theory of the free school, and why I thought that was important as we're going into the year of Baldwin, is because of what you said. Baldwin's unique phenomenology to the study of the U.S. people, and how that is the personality of the American people itself. Like the study of the American people is the consciousness of the American people. And through that, you can study what is the capacity of the American people. And you can only see the highest capacity within the Black freedom struggle and the freedom movement, within the King movement. You saw the capacity of the Black working class, the American people, striving for freedom, and being able to almost articulate in the way that you did, Jeremiah, like be able to almost be awake in a revolution. You know what I mean? Actualize what it is specifically that they need. And also what you said earlier, Emily, about how like people were the makings of society, which is also seen in the development of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery, campaign, or Birmingham. Like they were making a new edifice of American society. That is when you saw the capacity of the American people at their highest. And so like the struggle against the deep state is kind of in my mind, because it's a struggle for the American people to regain that capacity within, which is also what the deep state is a part of reconciling. Without the moral conscious and without the moral fiber, what do you replace in the human being for it to act out a particular purpose? And you have to go to what is being fed to the American people. You have to go to social media. You have to go to the education. You have to go. You have to demean. You have to take away, strip away what creates society, and replace it with something that is utterly fake and almost decadent. That it doesn't fulfill the human being. It doesn't create art. It creates nothing. And then people reason that. People reason with it. They think that that's, how you can get to a particular sense of truth. But without history, you can't get to the truth. Because a part of what you're saying, Jeremiah, about the arc of the moral history bends towards justice, it was an interesting formulation of King about the use of history and time. They come at a certain peak. But like, what is history without the people? What is history without the movement of everyday people struggling for a real democracy and peace? And how do you ignore, again, what actually has been occurring within Trump or Brics? Like, how then do you ignore these things? But the American regime and deep state make it possible for the American people not to see. And we are in the free school trying to also uncover that sheet, that veil. So that is an interesting thing to me, because with the way that I feel like if I were to ask Diane Nash, I would be like, why don't you write something about the nonviolent movement? I was like, and I would feel like her type of person and the person who I think she might be would be like, well, it's not as though she would disregard the past, nor will she try and isolate and kind of like freeze the past in a separate mode of thinking that isn't linked with today. But I think that she would also think about the present, meaning what are the conditions, what are people facing, and she'll go right down the list. What is it that people actually need to uncover that democracy that was being striven for in the, I guess the freedom struggle. And another thing I was thinking about is that I'm still blown away by the trip to Chicago, and how Brother Abel Muhammad and almost all of us have the clarity to know that the struggles that we were kind of working through, whether that be in the Black Panther Party or the Communist Party or whatever, or even, they're all hands of the same person struggling for democracy and freedom. But now we're at a particular time where we can actually see the relationship of the entire thing, of the entire operation. But I think I would also like to add to what he had said, because what he said was important, because he notes the fact that the ideological unity being a huge role in the unification of human beings, period. But I would like to say that the center of it all was King. The center of it all that everybody was wrapped in, whether they knew it or not, was working out what King was trying to work out. And I know we'll talk about the autobiography soon, but it's just so interesting how this balance that King was working out, the King and Coretta was working out, whether that be like with the question of nonviolence and how you apply that in America, or the question of like just what this society is and history and everything like that. There's a certain balance that King was trying to strike. And so I just want, you know what I mean?
I'm thinking.
It just makes me also think that
a certain balance. That's an interesting concept. Could you just say a little bit more before you conclude?
I mean, the only point with that I was just thinking about was how, like, or even the question about communism, like, it wasn't like he didn't read Marx or he didn't read Hegel, but that he said that he didn't want to own anything, but also didn't want to like have a society which just ran capitalistically, where everything was about ownership or anything, like those kinds of questions about society. This is all hearkening to the overall point that I'm saying about the capacity of the people and the fact that, again, yes, the struggle is still occurring, and that is something to be acknowledged of. But the possibilities that we're talking about is a chance to make a new world, in a way, a new America, and a lot of things are to be considered in that question alone.
I would like to add to this discussion. This is incredibly rich. By considering the interconnectedness and the parallels of the domestic and international crises that are blowing up right now in the face of the ruling class, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that this stuff is happening right about the same time. And when you're looking at it, especially, some of us have been reading neo-colonialism. A lot of this stuff looks the same on both sides of the pond right now, man. You have a financial media control of the state to override what you would call nominal political independence, but really override the will of the people. We don't have sanctions. They're not technically sanctioning the American people, but there is financial interests right now that are tightening their grips in some kind of ways and using media as well, especially when you talk about the neo-colonialism, where you try to defeat political candidates. It's too similar. And the ideological control that they've put upon the American people and they've put on internationally. I mean, I think it's the same. I think they practice and implement, experiment different strategies in different domains to see what works out. But really, what I think is the strongest interconnectedness and the greatest potential for the American people, as many people have been talking about, raising the capacities of the American people during this great time, tapping into their great capacity is seeing ourselves as two fronts of the same struggle right now, domestically and internationally. Uh, of course, I mean it's not just a matter of convenience that we have the same enemy, the American ruling elite. Although we should ally ourselves with people like that who share the same enemy. But when I view what's going on in America and internationally in terms of the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of the world, I view there being a negation of the Western path of society, internally and internationally, a path for the world that is increasingly benefiting less and less people every day. And so when the American people say we want a different path for ourselves, uh, and we can see the rest of the world doing the same thing, I think we can do it stronger together. Uh, and really, I view a parallel in history of a similar time, like in the Vietnam War, where on one front the American people say we don't want to fight this war, we don't want to go down this imperialist path, uh, which is destroying us from the inside, is in the soul and even financially as well, with leaving the gold standard and deindustrialization. And then the Vietnamese people themselves saying we're not going to be we're not going to be dominated. Uh, we want to defend ourselves so that we can have a path that suits our people. Uh, I feel that we have that kind of potential on an even larger scale right now, and the capacity to safeguard peace. Uh, and so, yeah, really, the potential of the American people is showing itself, and if we can use the teachings and the method of Du Bois and King and Baldwin to identify it, and elevate it, and direct it towards the future. Yeah, I think will be. I think that's the only way forward.
Maybe it's a good time to talk about Coretta, unless someone has something else to say.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a really small point, and this goes back to what Doc started today's conversation with, which is how Cornel West is, you know, is going to is not going to probably be part of the election in the key swing states where it'll where that will promote Biden's victory in those particular states. And when I sort of analyzed this and thought about it a little more, a lot of other things became clearer to me. I think that Cornel West is sort of bending a little bit under pressure, which is one of the reasons why he shifted from the People's Party to the Green Party. And this decision, if he eventually does make it to withdraw from key swing states, will be the influence of a kind of almost a PTSD that the Democrats suffer from when remembering Jill Stein, where Jill Stein has been vilified as this person who ran from the Green Party, and then she is said to be the major reason why Trump won in major swing states. And this is an argument that does come up over and over again, which is why people like Bhaskar Sankara says things like, oh, Cornel West should run as a Democrat. Because I think he knows that if Cornel West runs as a Democrat, he will never be the candidate to represent the Democratic Party, and hence it eliminates the possibility of a Jill Stein occurrence happening again. And I think that these are like just underlying considerations that are always being made by.
I'm sorry.
these are underlying considerations that are always being made by those in power, and which is why I think that Trump not bending under pressure, actually taking all of this in his stride, and Trump supporters are actually making more fake mugshots of Trump, saying that you can do all of this you want. We will do it even further, but it doesn't affect us. It doesn't affect our belief in the man. Um, and so, yeah, I think that I agree with everybody when they say that whether he knows it or not, whether he admits it or not, he's part of something bigger. He's part of something that started uh, before King, was strengthened by King, and is now coming into a sort of stage where it's all going to go down, in one way or another. So, yeah, and I thank everybody for today's conversation. It's really helpful.
Yeah, I wanted to just say one thing about Cornel West, and then maybe we can do comments before we move on to our next subject. But I actually think, okay, I don't know if this is true or not, but I actually think Cornel West is changing his tune a little bit, because recently I saw that on Meet the Press recently, he was asked if he will drop out, and he said, "No, I intend to be in this race until the end, because it's not just about this election. It's about a larger movement to break the two-party system." And I actually think that's him him coming closer to what we have been saying about how the triad has a deeper significance than just the election itself, but a democratic movement, like a movement that advances democracy. So I just want to say that, because I was like, oh, maybe he's watching Free School. Or like his advisors, we know his advisors watch Free School. So I was like, I actually thought that was a positive change in Cornel West, what he's saying about his own running.
And just one thing I would say, and this is another hurdle that Cornel is going to have to surmount, because he's so invested in this narrative that Trump is a neo-fascist thug. I mean, it's like he's looking in the wrong places for fascism. I mean, it is less than courageous, and it is not the way that Martin Luther King would have approached a very difficult question. Let me just make a quick analogy. When Martin Luther King came out against the war in Vietnam, he was attacking the state policy of the United States, not just the Johnson administration, the policy of the state, and it carried high risk with it. And I raise that to say that King understood the state. Cornel does not. Donald Trump is not the state. Donald Trump is under attack by the state. And it does not take rocket science. These indictments, this criminalization, these threats, even so much that Tucker Carlson has to ask him twice in the same interview, do you think they will kill you? And if Tucker Carlson is asking it, there are millions of other people. And that's the hurdle that Cornel is going to have to surmount. Because if he does not, there is no way he can logically say that he's going to be in it till the end. He's going to, if Trump is a neo-fascist thug, and he holds to that, and Cornel holds to that narrative, logically, he will have to withdraw from those states where it could be said that he is responsible for throwing the election to Trump. He will have to concede to the Biden administration. And if we are right, and I think we are, the Biden administration is the deep state. There is no separation here. It is the deep state. And I think that's where Cornell is going to have to go. I think already Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has conceded that Trump is attacked by the state. And so that's all I would say.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna read comments and then maybe we can transition to Coretta. But it seems like we have a lot of first-time commenters today. So Todd, Philip Logan, Jacob, Christopher Romero, BK, and others. Oh, and Marty say good morning. Jonah Koch said, good morning, everyone. My first time catching you all live. I've been watching some of your older live streams while reading Black Reconstruction, which is great. Lucy Schumacher says, President Trump has all proof of the stolen election. This fourth indictment will allow for discovery. The best is yet to come. May God bless all. And then heart prayer emoji. BK said facts. I think this was when you were talking about the Democratic Party and Trump. Todd is echoing the slogan Free Trump. Dust James says what he's been saying, which is that Trump is not ours. He doesn't represent us in the slightest. I'm glad he got arrested. We should build workers' power and get the rest of the war criminals locked up. And then he adds, Trump increased funding to the Nazis in Ukraine. The majority of Americans rightfully hate Trump as the exploiting, rich, narcissistic, blatant racist that he is.
Can I just make a comment here? Because actually, this is why I have nothing against even this necessarily. I have nothing politically against the music of Oliver Anthony, who Meghna mentioned. But I will say this is why I think there needs to be something questioned with the rise of Oliver Anthony. Because I think what Dust James is saying is like there is this tendency, I think, there's a preference for a middle. There's a preference for an ambiguity of Trump does not represent the working class. Trump does not represent the American people, but I also don't like Biden. Okay, that's too ambiguous for me for the time of political rebellion, because that's what Oliver Anthony in his song is promoting. It's political ambiguity. It is. Don't no, it is, Jeremiah, because and like, you can see in his tweets, like Oliver Anthony will say, he clarified his song and said, like, I don't support Biden, but also I don't support the GOP. I don't support any political party. Okay, but how can you be talking about the discontent and the devastation of the working class and then take this stance of political ambiguity when the workers I know, they're not ambiguous. They're very clear on the fact that there's a government that is completely does not care about them and also wants to, in some ways, even punish them more with the current war policy. And a lot of the working class is clear. A lot of the American people are also, there's a growing amount of people in America who are also clear on like, I am actually down with Trump. I'm not just not against him, but I'm down with him. And so I just want to bring that up because I think people think in political ambiguity represents the working class, but I actually don't think that's true. And I think there's something nefarious about promoting like this whole nonpartisan ambiguity thing.
Okay, I'm gonna just keep reading the comments because I feel like there's a mix of different opinions. But Jody Boris Pritchard said, can't wait for the trial. Anti-Americans on the wrong side of history, shame on you. There's a criminal establishment running this country and they're all in their 80s. And then Brother Jerome says, my next Africa Watch column will be focusing on deliberate negative media coverage of the Brics Summit. And German news reported on the Brics Summit using a Kenya-based Black reporter because they need an African face to spew their bullshit. Her name is Edith Kimani, and she opened the segment interviewing from Ukraine on their views of Brics with, of course, special emphasis on Russia. Why the F would you report on the Johannesburg Brics Summit from Ukraine? And even when interviewing from South Africa, the person being interviewed was cut short on their discussion of BRICS and the economic focus in order to push a geopolitical perspective. And then there's more to that comment, but sorry, I have to take a second to find it. But let's see. Yeah, so it's really some Eurocentric bullshit that's going on. And then Bilal Taylor says, sorry, I have to leave, but I truly appreciated the dialogue today. Layat Betra says, hard upvote on everything Serafina is saying. Without history, you can't get to the truth. It's so true that this is the crux of what makes the national security state and its mission so profane. The violence that it metes out to people is a mirror of what it does to history and the people's collective consciousness. And then, let's see. And then Todd just says, Du Bois, the police abolitionist, ... which I think is referring to this attempt to try to distort Du Bois and basically completely emphasize the wrong things or like just completely misappropriate him. And then Christopher Romero says, they called Oliver Anthony fatphobic for a couple of lines about how welfare makes people eat unhealthy foods. He made another video explaining how he was against politicians as a whole, which put a lot of the, quote, he's a hidden right-winger that the online left was spouting to bed. It showed how certain leftists are not interested in organic analysis from the working class. And I feel like that's kind of sort of related to what Emily was saying, where I do think that claiming that the working class is overall on the whole politically ambiguous is inaccurate. And I think it also shows that different people want to speak for or like basically claim that the working class is this or that, where I feel like the main thing is though, that I think that there is like diversity, but I think it would be, it's inaccurate to claim that most of them are anti-Trump. Like, I think that's just like factually inaccurate. But I think I can understand how in some ways there's like, oh, like maybe I don't love certain aspects of Trump, because I feel like other people have been saying like, oh, like the Central Park Five are awaiting apology and justice from Trump. But I think the thing is that like, you can dislike things about Trump, but I think that it's kind of another distortion to say that certain things that are distasteful are the whole man. And I also think that in some ways, like this third party thing that Cornel West is doing, like, I think that there's, I guess, built up distrust of both parties in some ways, but there needs to be room to like actually, I think, question like, okay, like where is the GOP actually moving? And then also, yeah, like what does a third party candidate like Cornel West represent? Which is why I think like the three, like Cornel West, RFK, and Trump all together are actually pretty important. And I think to also give Trump his credit, which is that without Trump, there would not have been space for someone like RFK Jr. or Cornel West, who are basically saying the same like anti-war sentiments and this questioning of the deep state that Trump was the first person to like really bring in to the mainstream and to even show that like over 50% of the American people are down with that. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to add, I think part of the, I guess, even going back to Doc's initial presentation, like part of the understanding of even like what this political moment means is that the attacks on Trump, the reason, like what the evidence shows in terms of all of these, like each indictment increases his political support. The underlying thread of that is that the attacks on Trump increase the capacity of the people to have an ideological counter to the ruling class and its propaganda. And that also part of what we understand in terms of the political, in some ways, like the political task moving forward, and in particular, the task of defeating Biden, that it's not even it's more that I feel like how I understand it or how I interpret things is that defeating Biden also is a political task and a political movement that will increase the capacity of the people, and that no one really understands this. And I think part of the, whether it's individuals or the larger left as a whole, the reason why they have such a reaction to whether it's Trump, even RFK Jr., even Cornel West to some extent, is that they, and I think this also gets like the Trotskyism thing, but so much of the left has basically indoctrinated an entire generation and is trying to indoctrinate an entire generation to be comfortable with being the permanent opposition within the status quo, to basically be a permanent fixture of the status quo. And when an actual political movement arises, which is trying to break the status quo, it's like it's almost similar, it's how Noam Chomsky also, like how he freaks out basically around Trump or anything. And it's like psychologically you're not prepared to deal with that because you have convinced yourself that your role is to be a permanent fixture of the existing status quo. And so when something actually arises that could actually break that, then psychologically you become almost like deranged in some ways, and you're not able to deal with the actual facts of the moment, but also the logic of the people as it is unfolding and developing. And instead you kind of resort to all of these like ad hominem things, or basically you're not able to psychologically deal with like the emergence of something new. But yeah.
Can I just say one thing, and I'm just building off what Jeremiah and others have said. One witnesses, while you get the withdrawing from certain elections, like here in Philadelphia, where 75% of Black registered voters did not participate. At the same time, people are more interested in politics. And, it's one of those great ironies that always occurs. And the other thing I'd just like to say, the ruling elite are doing us a service in that the people are getting political education and political lessons every day. And I don't know if they really want to put this Atlanta trial, this Georgia trial on television. Because as someone said, there'll be discovery. And Trump's words and what Trump intended and all of that will come out. And the question will be raised, which no court in Georgia was prepared to do in 2020. Were there malfeasances? Was there corruption? Were there things that went on that were illegal in who voted and how the votes were counted and yada, yada? We can go on and on. And if it occurred in Georgia, well, maybe in other states like Michigan or Wisconsin. So I think this is a huge political education for the people. Frankly, Watergate, which was televised, the Senate hearings and so on and congressional hearings, Watergate comes nowhere near this type of political education.
Yeah, I think this thing of the people being really smart and, leaders of the people being able to trust and count on that, that the people are smarter than this. I just think about so many things that happened during the Trump presidency that more intelligent people could see, but more dumb people who are so, used to the liberal, they're just following the liberal line. They just could not see it. And it tended to be more educated people. I just remember that press conference Trump did right after he literally was making peace in North Korea. And the first thing he said was, the most important decision a president can make is war and peace. Right. That's the most. Yeah. And then all the reporters, they didn't ask anything about that, but like, what about Me Too? What about Me Too? Me Too, Me Too. And then the headlines are like, oh, Trump is against Me Too. He's such a misogynist. But it's just like the main point is completely lost. And you see what the priorities of people are. And only if you're looking he's a misogynist, Me Too, you completely miss the larger. So, I feel like seeing these things, even though they're trying to craft a narrative, I do think people are seeing through, like you said, and that's part of the problem of the left is just fundamental love and belief in the people. I just think really at the heart of it, they just think they're dumb. I think Noam Chomsky thinks people are stupid because they're not rational like him. They're too emotional. He even said, I can't listen to King because he's too emotional. I like people who I prefer to listen to reason, which is so racist and so just, but he doesn't have any connection to people or love for people.
or any of that. So yeah, I just think what we're seeing live, it brings me back to those times during his presidency.
Right. Yeah. And there was a very interesting point that I think Purba said. And so, I mean, in the sense that I think for a lot of people, it might be shocking or jarring to hear us be like, there's a thread between King and civil rights movement and Trump. But I think what she said, basically, that the common thread is this thing of the people making history, the people entering the field of struggle, and it's not going to be the elites. And that is, I mean, I completely agree. That is the common thread. And, it's in motion, it's in development of the thing with Trump. But it's at this point, there's no denying it that Trump is the leader who is educating people about this thing. I mean, a lot of ways, the leader is an educator also. And he's educating people about their own potential and the fact that they can actually take on the deep state. I mean, that's the crazy thing about the mugshot. The mugshot, they're expecting him, I think, to kind of look cowering or something in a way that this would scare people, but he looks very defiant in the mugshot, which is hence why people are comparing his mugshot to King's and to Gandhi's and others. And I mean, it's just the thing, man. You got to give him credit for taking on such a horrific system, horrific forces, terrible forces in the deep state. So I mean, that's kind of the road the people are choosing. And then, as we've discussed, open it up to this wider triad of resistance. And another thing that shows the conscience of the people is how other candidates now are also trying to go radical. Like, the only interesting person in the GOP debate was this guy, Indian guy, Vivek Ramaswamy. And I don't know, honestly, I didn't like him until I didn't take him seriously. I thought he was a joke until this debate, when some stuff, okay, I also didn't like. I know that some stuff Emily and Jeremiah didn't appreciate that he said. But on the other hand, the fact that he's shifting to the anti-neocon position and taking on the neocons, and some stuff he said I was unexpected. Like, I mean, he said, no Ukraine war. I will not send our young men and women to die for Taiwan's nationalism. He said, no more. I think he's been questioning. He's saying we need to stop aid to Israel at some point, which is a real red line. And then he's like, we need to investigate January 6th, and we need to tie that to an investigation about 9/11 and the truth about 9/11. So it's just showing, and there's a new 1776 moment, and all that stuff is showing that at least he recognizes where the American people are at. I don't know how sincere he is about it and so on, but clearly the people's consciousness is at a place where the things which you are not supposed to say in mainstream media and so on, the questions you are not supposed to raise, are all on the table. And so it's a great time for ideological struggle. The stuff we say may get us canceled in places controlled by the liberal establishment, but among the masses, like Doc is saying, the masses are more political than ever in recent memory, more open to ideas than ever. And so it's a time of great opportunity.
Well, very quickly, I wanted to say this other thing. I mean, just going off of what Jahan is also saying, this thing when Tucker asked Trump, how are you able to deal with all of this? Like, they're throwing everything they have at you. And he invokes the spirit of the people, even there. Like, he's basically saying that the reason why I'm not losing my mind and my health and whatever is because I feel the support of the people standing behind me. And I haven't heard it in a public figure in a long time.
Yeah, well, also, speaking of King, I think that this August, I think, or sometime, maybe a couple months, is the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, 1963 to 2023.
No, Jahan, 2 days from now.
Oh, 2 days from now. Okay, yeah, right. So it is August, right?
Which, by the way, August 28th, which is also the 60th anniversary of the death of Du Bois.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
because he died. Yeah, they announced it during the.
So, this whole thing of the essence versus the substance. I mean, sorry, the appearance versus the essence of something. And it is always important when you try to view things as scientific lens, as we try to do. And there's a number of so-called civil rights organizations that are commemorating it. I think Al Sharpton and National Action Network, I believe some of the King Children and some other groups are doing this march. There was a very interesting article in the Final Call saying, 60 years after the March on Washington, America is still failing Black people. But basically it was criticizing these groups for not really being in the spirit of Martin Luther King, just using it in a very opportunistic way. And I don't doubt that they will probably say stuff in support of the Biden administration and anti-Trump, but that's why nobody even knows about it. I only know about it because I read about it in the Final Call. I don't think any of the masses who they're claiming to speak about know that this march is even happening. But on the other hand, what the discontent are doing, whether it's marching behind Trump, whether it's the triad of resistance, whether it's the new peace movement that's developing, I mean, that's much more in the spirit of the March on Washington and so on, as we've been discussing. So it's very interesting on what can happen in 60 years, how much the consciousness of people can shift, and the impact of all those struggles, how they've set the basis for what we are engaged in now.
Yeah, maybe this is a good segue into Coretta. Because I think what you're saying, Jahan, about these nonprofits and even some of the King children, in some ways, like, it's really sad because I think a big move by the ruling class, and like Henry Winston says, this is not just the physical assassination of King, but the assassination of his ideas and the task he left with the American people. Because that's something Coretta. So I finally finished Coretta's autobiography, and that is actually it was really in some ways almost painful for me to finish it, because like the book became so close to my heart that I didn't want it to end, and I knew what was coming at the end.
Yeah.
And so she makes that point where she said, I was gonna say this later on, but she does make the point where she says King was at peace with his death, and it's why he became very frantic at the end of his life, because he was trying to conscientiously prepare the people closest to him to continue the spirit of his life and the movement beyond his physical existence. And it is like, and that's the whole point, is that the ruling elite, the deep state, had to assassinate that spirit. And that's what you get with like what Jahan was saying about these, especially the nonprofit industry, which is an arm of the deep state at this point, contributing to the assassination of King over and over again. But I also wanted to say that Coretta has been an enigma to me for so long. And like finishing the autobiography, building upon last week's conversation, I know that Nuri read the whole book. What took me, I usually take a week to read one chapter, but Nuri finished the whole damn book. Nuri actually, I wanted to make this distinction because Nuri was reading the wrong autobiography. And this is related because, so I have both. And I want to actually make this point to the public because Coretta was always an enigma to me because I was first gifted this autobiography. But this was published in 2017 after her death. So, there's questions of were they given permission? And I actually suspect that I think one of Coretta's children, Bernice, gave permission to this Reverend Barbara Reynolds, who I'm not familiar with, to finish her new autobiography. I want to make this point because the real autobiography is this one from 1969. I finally got a date on it. And the reason why this becomes important is because I realized, I was like, this 2017 autobiography is not something Coretta would have approved. And it actually presents her more in a feminist light. And it's because I was so confused when I first read this one, because I was like, this doesn't seem like a person who would necessarily be Martin's wife. What I knew of Coretta? And I realized it. It's because this autobiography in 2017 was published. It was meant to make Coretta Scott King an individual, a woman, like an individual woman. When actually Coretta Scott King, she says it over and over again in her 1969 autobiography. She says, there is no me. There's no Coretta. I am King. I'm my husband. And actually both of them believed in revolutionary love, which is we are actually not even Martin and Coretta. We are the movement. You know what I mean? We are God's instruments. And that's why Coretta's autobiography in 1969, it's her life, where she comes from, the South, her parents, the fact that her mother told her, I was a woman since I was a child. I was forced to become a woman since I was a child. And then her father, who always never gave up, no matter how many times his businesses were burned down by white people in the South, he never had bitterness. He had an optimistic attitude of, I'll find a way. And the credit starts there and it ends with King's assassination and her presenting a task to the American people to give her husband eternal peace by fulfilling freedom and democracy. Because that's how Coretta saw her life. Her life was the movement. Her life was Martin. And it didn't mean that she was submissive. It didn't mean that she was XYZ. She was not what feminists want to see her as. She saw herself as an instrument of God who was blessed to have been brought to Martin so she could fulfill a divine duty. And that's also why the cover photo is her and Martin. Her literal autobiography is My Life with Martin Luther King Jr. And then you have this autobiography, this young photo, glamorous. It's trying to show her like as a woman. Like, oh, Coretta, the autobiography is Coretta, my life, my love, my legacy. No, that's not how Coretta talked at all. So anyways, I want to make that point because this is a public service announcement to not buy this book or read it, and actually to buy the 1969 version, because there's an ideological assassination of Coretta Scott King, which is, I think, a second wave of an assassination attempt on Martin Luther King Jr. by assassinating her and who she was. So anyways, that's how I wanted to begin, because it made me very angry when I realized that. And Nur can also attest to this because she read both autobiographies, unfortunately, too. Do you want to say something?
No, yeah, I did read both. And okay, like there is something actually kind of misleading about it because there are paragraphs that are verbatim, like basically exactly the same between the 1969 version and then this modern version. And so it's very confusing because, yeah, there are like places that seem a little bit different, but where it really like takes like the main differences I would say between them in terms of actual content is that the 1969 one, which is My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., is actually a really good history of the civil rights movement. Like from the very beginning, it goes through every single campaign, and Coretta talks about like what was the thinking behind Martin Luther King and the SCLC in terms of like choosing why to pursue certain campaigns, whether or not to like obey or disobey like federal injunctions, like the thought process, which was like King, like it also shows how much King wanted to embrace suffering as redemptive, like actually embracing it, and how much he literally like basically lived like to aspire to be like Jesus. Like I didn't like that did not hit me like how clearly he saw his life in those terms. And I think with everything that we've been talking about like the Black prophetic tradition and how King like literally was like the second coming of Jesus, like even his death was around like Easter and Good Friday and like stuff like that. And then the fact that like Coretta and King both like basically knew what it meant. And so basically like the 1969 one is a very like it's a good summary, like it actually goes through every single campaign, whereas the 2017 one, which is My Life, My Love, My Legacy, Coretta is basically like Barbara Reynolds, I think, frames it as like those three separate things where it's like Coretta's life, like Martin Luther King, and then the legacy. And so this 2017 one has, I would say like about half of the book is the civil rights, like life with Martin Luther King. And then about a third of it is describing all of her children and the trajectory that her children took. And then also about a third of it to a half of it is about the Martin Luther King like nonviolent center that Coretta like worked to establish. And then sort of talking about all of like the nonprofit work and then stuff into like the 80s and the 90s. And actually it's only at the end where I think Barbara Reynolds actually introduces herself, where I think she tried to interview Coretta through, I think, like the 1960s. So she had been around for a while. And then she basically says like, oh, I think maybe Coretta was grooming me to write like her memoir for her. But then it's also pretty disingenuous because nowhere does it say like, oh, like I wrote this, like I put this together like 10 years after Coretta Scott King died. Actually, I was under the impression that it came out like basically like in her last years of life. Like I feel like that's consciously how it tries to present itself. And so I feel like it is pretty misleading because also it's easier to find the more modern one. Like at least it's much easier to find the 2017 one. And so when I was reading it, I was under the impression that like this was the main one, but it's not true. Like it's really bad. And so that was why I was like, oh, I have to like read the actual one before this Saturday. And I like panicked, but they're actually like, and I think it's actually even more misleading because the 2017 one tries to contain or condense all of the stuff from the 1969 one, but to just say like, oh, that was just a small part of my life and my contribution. And actually like my great contribution after King's death was to set up this nonprofit center. And like, this is like so important because this is how the world will remember Martin Luther King Jr. And yeah, so I would say that the first one, which was actually like written very much, I think like during the struggle and came out so close afterwards, because I feel like that was also when Coretta was really aware of how nonviolence itself like was being challenged and kind of attacked by Black power and nationalism and stuff like that. And so I think she wanted to set the record straight and say like, this is the true meaning of nonviolence. Like this is where we have to go. And I think also interpreting the assassination of King as an attempt to basically erase his ideas, but to say no, like the nonviolent struggle is the right one. The death of King does not mean that nonviolence failed. It actually shows the meaning and the depth of King's ultimate sacrifice. Like this is how far he's willing to go. This is how far he's able to embrace suffering, to try to take on the suffering of basically all of humanity. And I feel like I think that's just an important way of, I think, reframing nonviolence, where the fact that I think it's not just like, oh, King knew that he was going to be assassinated by the deep state, but like he just cared so much. I think it's that he knew in some ways like how far he was willing to go. And I think also the fact that like Coretta, like Ralph Abernathy, or like Reverend Shuttlesworth, like all of them were willing to literally die for humanity. And I feel like that was also one of the main themes, which is like, be ashamed to die until you've actually like done something for humanity. And then there's also this King quote that was like, your life doesn't mean anything unless you're willing to die for something. And yeah, but I feel like all of those themes are like not really, they're kind of suppressed in the 2017 one. And I think especially knowing that like those are not Coretta's words, those are somebody else's words, literally trying to speak for Coretta, I think is pretty important. So
yeah, so that was me and Nur trying to set the record straight. And also, because like if you notice, the 2017 memoir autobiography does not have a dedication, but the 1969 autobiography, which is not even, I don't think it's printed anymore. Isn't that also interesting? It's not printed. And it's the 2017 version that is, but the 1969 dedication, and then like we can, build off of last week and like discuss things that we weren't able to say last time because we didn't finish the autobiography. Coretta says, this book is dedicated to the memory of my late husband, whose noble life of unselfish devotion to love, justice, and truth I was privileged to share. And from that sharing derived immeasurable fulfillment. You know what I mean? Like, that's how she saw herself in her life. And I don't know about her last years of her life, but the thing is no one will know, because the thing that also people don't realize is she is an intellectual, highly brilliant, very much carries the ideas of the movement, philosophically shaped by King. And so I know, and like you see those photos of her with Winnie Mandela, she doesn't stop. She continues to be part of a world movement for freedom. And so I kind of don't trust the way she's being pushed in the 2017 autobiography. So I guess I'll go briefly over some things I just wanted to say, and then I know Nuri, you probably have a lot to say too. So I don't want to take too long, but the first thing I just wanted to say is what Nuri said. Of course, the end, like I had 30 pages left after last week to finish the autobiography. And it was painful to read because it was about how Coretta and Martin both knew that King did not have many days left. And so she talks a lot about how before he goes to Memphis, she says, Martin had said to me, quote, I probably won't live a long life, but if I die, I don't want you to grieve for me. You go on and live a normal life. And then also, like Nuri said, he interprets his own death as a crucifixion, where he's like, I'm ready for the day. Because yeah, it's so interesting, like just it's what Nuri said about Coretta also interprets King as Jesus-like, and his assassination as a crucifixion meant to show humanity that they need to save themselves. And like someone who loved humanity so much that he paid for their sins. Like it's so interesting. And I want to read I wanted to read before I read both Coretta's words after his assassination and Harry Belafonte's words after his assassination, which, by the way, Coretta includes on purpose in her autobiography, is that she talks a lot about how King, he starts getting more almost like very frantic, like he's working all the time, not almost never sleeping. And it's because she's like, I think Martin knew his time would come soon. And so he's working very closely with the young staff of the SCLC to he starts thinking, because after he gets the Nobel Peace Prize and then his stance against the Vietnam War, that's when King decides, actually, because King is very, Martin Luther King Jr. is very stressed about increasing riots happening, especially in the North. And so he's trying to look for an answer, like, okay, what is a solution? How do we can't just be in the South anymore. What is a solution that unites the North and the South? And that's when he conceives of the Poor People's Campaign. And Coretta makes a point to say, the reason why we came to the decision on a Poor People's Campaign is because we understood that taking a stance against war and for world peace meant engaging in a war against poverty. Like, she's explicit about that, where she says it is because King starts feeling the need to fulfill a certain role in a world peace movement that he decides the way to do that is to unite the youth of the North and the South, like unite people of the North and the South in a common battle against war and against poverty. And then she even says, she was like, we believed that it would be a deterrent for riots as well, because what it would do is it would show, especially young people, it would give them an avenue of hope rather than allow them to sit in despair. And yeah, so the way she's purpose, she's also trying to, it's like Nuri said, she wants to explain to you the philosophic path, the strategy and the philosophy behind all this. And so Martin Luther King Jr. starts getting very serious with his staff, where he's like, because he's basically preparing them. Coretta says, I think he was preparing them to keep up the charge after he leaves. Because she says, well, first of all, he said, when people urged him to be careful, Martin said, I cannot worry about my safety. I cannot live in fear. I have to function. If there is any one fear I have conquered, it is the fear of death, end quote. He talked about it in his sermons and quoted again the phrase, quote, like Neri said, if a man has not found something worth giving his life for, he is not fit to live. And then she says, the last few months before his death were lived at a frantic pace. I think the feeling of the tremendous urgency he had toward the Poor People's Campaign and the preparation that he tried to give his staff so they could carry on without him are indications of this. He worked at it as if it was to be his last and final assignment. At SCLC staff and board meetings, he would say with increasing frequency, quote, if anything happens to me, you must be prepared to continue, end quote. And then she also talks about how when he goes to Memphis and he feels like he failed because a march they were supposed to go on with the sanitation workers ends up having like riots because of like certain youth who weren't part of the march coming and destroying things. He gets very stressed, but then he comes back home to Atlanta with the SCLC staff, and they decide, like, they have something that Coretta saw as a Last Supper. She's like, I feel like what was happened was a Last Supper, where he basically, it was kind of like this critique where he starts engaging in serious critique of SCLC, saying, here are our weaknesses, here are our strengths, here is each one of you, my staff members, here are your weaknesses, here are your strengths. And what he was doing was, she was like, I felt like Jesus at a Last Supper, he was telling his disciples, be serious. And I actually wanted to read from it. I have a lot of random quotes where, yeah, Martin was more blunt and emphatic than he had ever been before. He evaluated the weaknesses in the field organization, the quality of spirit, and the tendencies to be distracted from the principal goals of the hour. As one participant remarked, quote, when Martin combined his penetrating criticism with his eloquence, it was a withering fire, end quote. All of the people present were themselves articulate and experienced. A vigorous discussion ensued, and few were sparing in their self-criticism. In the light of what happened later, those who were involved in that genuinely soul-searching meeting have said it was a little like the Last Supper. Members of the staff still talk a lot about that meeting. They remember it so well and the emotional impact it had on them. Martin felt so much agony, and experienced so much conflict because the staff was not cooperative and supportive of his going back to Memphis. There was no enthusiasm. They hoped he would give up on the project. He kept talking to them and trying to prevail upon them. He went around the room and told each person what they needed to do. He criticized them one by one. It was like the way the Last Supper is described, when Christ told Judas that he would betray him and then spoke to Peter and the others. Martin said that he wanted anyone in the organization who turned to violence to be fired, and then pointed out who was getting out of line. The meeting got very emotional and he got upset and left. He knew that if he did that, they would probably come around. That is just what they did. But yeah, and then what happens is, I also want to point out that the SCLC, completely a revolutionary organization, that discipline, the organizational work. And after that meeting, Martin so convinced all his staff that Memphis was worth organizing and bringing their resources that Coretta even says, she was like, we sent our top staff to Memphis and we began to do we like cut turf for everyone and we began to do meetings and just that organizational energy. But yeah, I think I got distracted, but yeah. And so I just wanted to point out that King, as like, just like Nuri said, King as this Jesus like figure who Coretta is she's very conscious of that. And I pointed out the 2017 autobiography because I just admire her so much, because when she talks about Martin Luther King Jr.'s supreme sacrifice, which is his death. But I also feel like Coretta herself, because she feels like she is Martin. She's like, I am Martin's disciple. It's her supreme sacrifice too. But then she says something so deep where she said, after King's assassination, I rededicated myself to the nonviolent struggle. That word, she was like, it's almost like she was like, I became reborn. I rededicated myself because a new me had to rise up to where the movement was heading. And I think to end, I just wanted to read what she told the press about Martin Luther King Jr. after his assassination, and then also what Harry Belafonte said, because Coretta makes a point to say, she said, Martin Luther King Jr.'s two best friends were Harry Belafonte and a man named Stanley Levison. Yes, that's what she said. And so she said, she was like, hey, I trusted Harry Belafonte above everyone. And Harry Belafonte, immediately after the assassination, he came to Atlanta to be with her and was with her for all five, like I think there was 4 different funeral processions. He was there for every single one of them. And she says, and it was Harry Belafonte who told Coretta, like, you should probably give a statement to the press. I know it'd be hard, but I think it's needed. The people need to hear you. And so she said, my husband often told the children that if a man had nothing that was worth dying for, then he was not fit to live. He said also that it's not how long you live, but how well you live. He knew that at any moment his physical life could be cut short, and we faced this possibility squarely and honestly. My husband faced the possibility of death without bitterness or hatred. He knew that this was a sick society, totally infested with racism and violence, that questioned his integrity, maligned his motives, and distorted his views, which would ultimately lead to his death. And he struggled with every ounce of his energy to save that society from itself. He never hated, he never despaired of well-doing, and he encouraged us to do likewise. And so he prepared us constantly for the tragedy. I am surprised and pleased at the success of his teaching for our children. Say calmly, quote, "Daddy is not dead. He may be physically dead, but his spirit will never die." Ours has been a religious home, and this too has made this burden easier to bear. Our concern now is that his work does not die. He gave his life for the poor of the world, the garbage workers of Memphis and the peasants of Vietnam. Nothing hurt him more than that man could attempt no way to solve problems except through violence. He gave his life in search of a more excellent way, a more effective way, a creative rather than destructive way. We intend to go on in search of that way, and I hope that you who loved and admired him would join us in fulfilling his dream. The day that Negro people and others in bondage are truly free, on the day want is abolished, on the day wars are no more, on that day, I know my husband will rest in a long-deserved peace. Yeah, because that last line is what gets me. Like, let us fight so that Martin Luther King Jr. can have at last have his long-deserved peace. Because that's what she was saying when that video we had showed at Free School, where years later, once they made Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a federal holiday, she says, may we be worthy of his life. Like, she's basically calling upon, and this is what Serafina, I think, was saying, where it's almost like King believed and trusted his own staff, but also the American people to take on a task he would not be able to see. That's the whole point of the speech. I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop. And it's almost like she's also saying that. She's like, don't forget, don't let him have died in vain. She's like, we can fulfill, like we need to fulfill that day of freedom so that King's life was not lost in vain, so that my husband can at last rest in long-deserved peace. And yeah, just that, I don't know, it's very emotional. And then the one last thing I wanted to read about King was she calls Harry Belafonte her most devoted and trusted friend. And she says Harry Belafonte and Stanley Levison wrote a little speech for Martin Luther King Jr. And I really like the way they describe it, because it also, for me, I just feel like it really describes the way Free School sees the Black freedom struggle and the way that the youth today can claim the Black freedom struggle, the true essence, to free this country, to free humanity. And it says, so this is by Harry Belafonte and Stanley Levison. It says, quote, "In a nation tenaciously racist, a Black man sensitized its somnolent conscience. In a nation sick with violence, a Black man preached nonviolence. In a nation corrosive with alienation, a Black man preached love. In a world embroiled in 3 wars in 20 years, it was a Black man who preached peace." And I just love that, because it's almost like what Gandhi said, where Gandhi was like, this world historical development thing, where Gandhi was like, it will be the Negro who brings nonviolence, like who uses nonviolence to save the world, to provide new meaning. And yeah, and I also find it deep because Coretta also makes the point to say one of King's last speeches was to honor Dr. Du Bois. And she talks about it. And she basically says Du Bois was one of King's heroes, especially Black Reconstruction in America. And you know what I mean? And and then also you hear it in Harry Belafonte as well. This thing of like, it is the Black proletariat. It was a Black man from the South, the Black proletariat, who brought humanity back to a nation that had lost it. Or you hear it in Coretta where she says King gave his entire life in earnest to hope so that society could save itself, so society could be saved from itself. And that is why nonviolence as that scientific instrument is so important, nonviolence, that the way Coretta describes it, as a creative, more effective way rather than a destructive way. And yeah, and I guess the last two things I want to say is it's very emotional too, because like Daddy King, after Coretta says that after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, she says Daddy King tried to be strong, but he made this comment where he said, "I always felt that I would go first." You know, and then, but you know, at the same time, it was King's family that they were the first to be such disciples of and followers of Martin Luther King Jr. that they had also accepted the response that he belonged to the world. And Coretta also says that Martin Luther King Jr. knew that his time was going to be up, because he said he would tell her, like, I know the price that people who speak the truth pay. Like he said, I know the price that people who basically take a stand against their own government in a crisis like this pay, what you were saying, Doc. And then also the president of Morehouse, Benjamin Mays, so Coretta asked him to give King's eulogy, like the real eulogy, at the burial when King is interred. And when she asks Benjamin Mays, she says, Martin would always tell me how much he hoped that you would give his eulogy. And then Benjamin said, well, that's funny because I wanted Martin to give my eulogy. You know, that emotional impact. Yeah, so it was really emotional to say goodbye to the book, because Coretta is such a revolutionary woman. And I think her legacy is deliberately distorted for a reason too, because she is I think she's the next best person to King to embody the values of nonviolence in that movement. And I think she had to be also deliberately buried, and especially for feminism to wield its values against her. And yeah, and it's also just, you know, I feel it personally too, because Coretta is such a woman. Like, she's such a revolutionary woman, a mother to a movement, the way, and like it's what you said last week, Doc, where it was not about romantic love, it was about revolutionary love for the people that kept Martin and Coretta together. And even though they didn't believe in destiny, like, I do think Coretta even says Coretta does say, she's like, I think Martin and I were meant to be divine instruments of God's will. And so yeah, I'll stop there. And I know Nuri and Serafina also read the book, so maybe they can also contribute something.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like
Let
that.
me ask just a small request. Last week you spoke about time, Nuri.
Oh yeah.
You haven't had a chance to go back and listen. Could you kind of recap some of that?
Okay, so I think one caveat is that, yes, last week when I was talking about it, I was reading the wrong book, but I had only been reading the civil rights movement part. Like, I hadn't gotten to the last, like, 2/3 of it. And so I think the chapter titles are different, but the chapter that I was referring to, like, was chapter 5 in the bad book, and it was like time itself was ready. And I think that's like sort of the weird thing about the Barbara Reynolds book, which is that it takes a lot of Coretta's words, or like actually verbatim paragraphs from the original autobiography, and then it tries to sort of get you hooked or to believe in it, and then it turns really bad at the end. But I thought the time itself was ready was really deep, because it was sort of saying that, you know, there are like people like Du Bois, or like people who are living in Jim Crow after Reconstruction. Like, it's not as though they didn't struggle, and it's not as though they didn't make contributions, like A. Philip Randolph and people like that, but that for some reason it was in the 1950s and the 1960s that the movement, like basically the cause, because Coretta capitalizes cause with like a capital C, but that basically like part of the idea, I think, was that at that time, like, it was like God decided, or like God ordained, that was the time that there was going to be a break, or that there was going to be like a big move. And so I think I had been thinking about that also because of the Nation of Islam like service where they're talking about the time. And I feel like in a lot of ways, like I think just the way that we talk about time and what it, I guess, like time and history, and when time like basically yields to history, or when history becomes bigger than time in some ways. But yeah, and I also think that this is sort of a tangent going off of that, but it's actually, I think, through Coretta's autobiography that I got a better sense of how time actually moved from the bus boycott, like the Montgomery bus boycotts, like through to like 1968, because there are certain, I think, moments of history, like we read, I think like when you read the civil rights movement, you're like, oh, there was Montgomery, and then there was like other things, there was like Albany, there was Selma, there was the Chicago era, and then there was like King's stance against the Vietnam War. And I think like those things organically build on each other. But it was really amazing to like read about Montgomery, like 1955 to 1956, and then it's actually like in that period that King, I think, becomes a well-known, like how quickly he becomes a national figure. Like it's so fast. They're literally like what, like 26 or 28 or something, and it's already within Montgomery where they realize like, oh, I could die for this. Like my home could be bombed, like my children could be killed, but I will keep going. Like I have to keep going. And it's just 3 years in when King is stabbed. Like he's stabbed in like a department store in New York, and that's 1958. That's 3 years in. And so it's actually, and then at that time, King and I think Coretta both realized like, actually, like this is very possible and it's quite likely to happen. And so it's actually kind of amazing to think that King had 10 years after that, basically after his near-death experience. And he was working, I think, knowing that every year he got was basically a year given by God. And then also, I think going into Kennedy, I hadn't realized how quickly Kennedy was assassinated, like basically into his presidential term. Like it was really fast. And it was like Kennedy first became acquainted with the King family when he was a senator, because King was in jail, and then Coretta couldn't get in contact with him. And like she was so desperate, and then the Kennedys called her and was like, oh, like, is there anything I can do? And it was right before the presidential election. And so it was basically, I think, the result of the Kennedys trying to make sure that Martin Luther King was safe, that a lot of Black people voted for him. And that was actually, I think, one of the reasons, like one of the key reasons why Kennedy was elected in the first place. But it was just like 3 years in, and like literally right after the March on Washington, Kennedy's assassinated. And after that, Martin Luther King, I think, literally says to Coretta, like, that is what they're going to do to me. Like he says it explicitly, like what they did to JFK, like they're going to do that to me. And so you can see, I think, how like things are really ramping up. And then from like 1963 like to 1968, like he still had 5 years. But like I think just the timing of things, and even like the Memphis, like what happened in Memphis, it's amazing how much I think King was like so beholden to his conscience too, because strategically I think people were saying like, oh, like maybe you should not go to Memphis, like we should just focus on the Poor People's Campaign, like this is hard enough anyway. But King says like, no, like I have to go, like this is the right thing to do. And I think that was also a big part of a lot of the different campaigns that happened in the civil rights movement, where the people wanted to move, but Martin just wanted to, I think, encourage them or like give them the moral strength. And then he was so like, his conscience would be like so, I think, like tormented almost by like the idea that like a campaign might fail because he didn't support them, or like it failed because like the people weren't prepared enough or weren't ready enough. And and so I think it's like the time, but then also I guess I think King just as like a vessel for all of that, and how much he like embraced it, because it's even like the way that he approached, I guess, his like sermons, where sometimes he really wouldn't have time and he was like, I just have to meditate with God, and then he like does it. And you like, the thing is that at that point it's like, you know, that can't be possible unless like something really is on your side. So
Okay, first, thank you, Emily, for bringing this book to our attention, because I think Free School has studied India, the nonviolent, the civil rights movement, even in meeting Lawson, and there's just a lot that we have yet to uncover. And I think this is an important step forward to continue to uncover our inheritance. And second thing, the nature in which the Coretta Scott King wrote of the time following King's assassination. And the initial assumption about that is that there was a very riotous, everybody was rioting all over the country. It was fire. But in the autobiography, Coretta almost mentioned the riots as a secondary. Coretta speaks about that time where the entire American people, white, black, Protestant, Jewish, whatever, Muslim, were coming together to do a lot of things: mourn, celebrate his life, learn about next steps, but be together after King was assassinated, and his sacrifice. There's a lot of ways that Coretta talked about that period, because, you know, it wasn't only that she was prepared, but that she had to talk to her kids about it. And that in talking with them, for example, like, I think she would tell the Marty, the third, that the reason was unimportant. You know, it wasn't solely about the fact that the father was dead, but that everybody was coming together to know of nonviolence because of Martin's message. Everybody was coming together. And I think Harry Belafonte also said in another occasion that people learned more about nonviolence. People were understanding more. I think Marty was like, oh yeah, I think one of my teachers are understanding more about my dad's life. You know, things were happening in that way, where the consciousness of the American people were also getting not only unified, but understanding more. And that is a different view that I didn't have of after the death of King, because I knew that the death was coming at the end of the, or at some point of the book, and I wasn't quite sure if. And I kept reading. I read all the way to the index. I was like, when will Coretta give me instruction? When will she say, you know, speak to me more? Because I want her not to stop. But in a way, she already kind of did. I just wanted more. It was the way that she ended the book, which is the ultimate responsibility and question for our moment, yet that everybody almost was highlighting. Not only was that Martin Luther King's life was lived with a purpose, and it didn't matter the length of the life that he lived, but that now we have the responsibility to move forward with the torch that King led with. Like, I'm just looking around Doc's desk, the Black Reconstruction event, the Black proletariat and the Fourth American Revolution, the making of a new American people. Yeah. And that wording, like the making of the new American people, was thought about because we were thinking that the American people today are different, while also considering that a new American people was ultimately emerging after the freedom struggle. Right. That's right. So what does that make the American people today? But I also, this is the side, you know, kind of, sort of, but I wanted to emphasize a little bit in Benjamin E. Mays' eulogy and how he tied, like, kind of, I just wanted to read just a portion of it. It might be too long, just let me know. But it says, let it be thoroughly understood that our deceased brother did not embrace nonviolence out of fear or cowardice. Moral courage was one of his noblest virtues. As Mahatma Gandhi challenged the British Empire without a sword and wand, Martin Luther King Jr. challenged the interracial wrongs of his country without a gun. And he had the faith to believe that he would win the battle for social justice. I make bold, and I thought like it's so funny how he said that. I make bold to assert that it took more courage for King to practice nonviolence than it took his assassin to fire the fatal shot. The assassin is a coward. He committed his foul act and fled. When Martin Luther disobeyed an unjust law, he accepted the consequences of his actions. He never ran away and he never begged for mercy. He returned to the Birmingham jail to serve his time. Perhaps he was more courageous than soldiers who fight and die on the battlefield. This is an element of compulsion in their dying. Or he says, there is an element of compulsion in their dying. But when Martin Luther faced death again and again and finally embraced it, there was no external pressure. He was acting on an inner compulsion that drove him on. More courageous than those who advocate violence as a way out, for they carry weapons of destruction for defense. But Martin Luther faced the dogs, the police, jail, heavy criticism, and finally death. And he never carried a gun, not even a knife to defend himself. He had only his faith in a just God to rely on, and the belief that thrice is he armed who has his quarrels just. The faith that Browning writes about when he says, one who never turned his back, but marched breast forward, never doubted that clouds would break, never dreamed that right through, though worsted wrong, would triumph. Held, we fall to rise, and are baffled to fight better, sleep to awake. Coupled with moral courage was Martin Luther King Jr.'s capacity to love people. Though deeply committed to a program for freedom for Negroes, he had love and concern for all kinds of people. He drew no distinction between the high and the low, between the rich and the poor. He believed that he was sent to champion the cause of the man farthest down. He would probably say that if death had to come, I'm sure there is no greater cause to die for than fighting to get a just wage for garbage collectors. He was super race, super nation, super denomination, super class, and super culture. He belonged to the world and to mankind, and now he belongs to posterity. But there's a dichotomy in all this. This man was loved by some and hated by others. If any man knew the meaning of suffering, King knew. House-bombed, living day by day, for 13 years under constant threats of death, maliciously accused of being a communist, falsely accused of being insincere and seeking the limelight of his own glory, stabbed by a member of his own race, slugged in a hotel lobby, jailed over 20 times, occasionally deeply hurt because friends betrayed him. And yet this man had no bitterness in his heart, no rancor in his soul, no revenge in his mind. And he went up and down the length and breadth of this world, preaching nonviolence and the redemptive power of love. He believed with all of his heart, mind, and soul that the way to peace and brotherhood is through nonviolence, love, and suffering. He was severely criticized for his opposition to the war in Vietnam. It must be said, however, that one could hardly expect the profit of Dr. King's commitments to advocate nonviolence at home and violence in Vietnam. Nonviolence to King was a total commitment not only to solving the problems of race in the United States, but in solving the problems of the world. And I want to read another part that says that he was not ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. No man is ahead of his time. Every man is within his star, each in his time. Each man must respond to the call of God in his lifetime and not in somebody else's lifetime. Mm-hmm. Jesus had to respond to the call of God in the 1st century AD and not in the 20th century. He had but one life to live. He couldn't wait, even though he died young. How long do you think Jesus would have had to wait for the constituent authorities to accept him? 25 years, 100 years, 1,000. He died at 33. He couldn't wait. Paul, Galileo, Copernicus, Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, Gandhi, and Nehru couldn't wait for another time. They had to act in their lifetime. No man is ahead of his time. Abraham leaving his country to the obedience of God's call, Moses leading a rebellious people to the promised land, Jesus dying on the cross, Galileo on his knees recanting, Lincoln dying of an assassin's bullet, Woodrow Wilson crusading for the League of Nations, and Martin Luther King Jr. dying, fighting for justice for garbage collectors. None of these men were ahead of their time. With them, the time was always right to do that which was right and that which needs to be done.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, I'm really grateful to everyone who read the book. And in the comments, we shared like the PDF of the original 1969 version, so people can read and download it if they can't get a physical copy. But I just wanted to add one thing I think related to this, which is I know for the year of Baldwin, we've been thinking about this concept of the divinity of the oppressed and the divinity of mankind. And I think, and I feel like it comes out in Coretta Scott King, but especially King's concept of like the colony of time and the empire of eternity, in which King makes the point that we, like he says, we as Christians, but it's like we as any people who are concerned about our children, concerned about the state of the country, that like we owe our allegiance to like this empire of eternity. And actually it reminds me of I found this essay or an article by Anne Braden called Finding the Other America that she published during like the Hurricane Katrina years in the early 2000s. But basically she says something similar where it's like the divinity of human beings can be found in those who are able to envision a future and envision a different world and a different society, and to live in, it's almost like you live in that new world. You live in that, like what James Baldwin called like the New Jerusalem, and you also live to work to bring that future into existence. And yeah, I think, like, I don't know, it's also really interesting, I guess, to think about that in relation to like King and the particular I don't know, it's almost hard to think about like all of the parallels between King and Christ. And in particular, like I feel like it, like I guess I first got a sense of this when watching that documentary King in the Wilderness, but there's a particular moment, when like Harry Belafonte is also recounting like King's like nervous tic that he developed, and then what it, like that moment when he stopped having that tic. And Harry Belafonte recounts it by saying like, oh, like I finally accepted my death, like fully accepted my death. And it's very reminiscent of the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is like, he's basically, well, first of all of his disciples are like sleeping, and he's like, come on, you have to like stay awake through this. And then it's very similar to how you guys are describing like the Last Supper and like King kind of admonishing the members of the SCLC. But the particular moment in the Garden of Gethsemane is like Jesus is praying because he knows he's about to be crucified, and he's basically making one last plea to God, and he's saying like, basically pleading like, can you take this cup from me? And the cup is the cup of suffering and the cup of sacrifice. But he knows that ultimately he has to drink this cup, and that it is basically for the salvation of mankind. And I feel like it was basically reading King, especially reading some of his like actual sermons in his book Strength to Love, that actually I feel like made me a Christian again, although a different kind of Christian, I think, than the one I was kind of raised to be. And yeah, I don't know. Those are just like, I guess, some thoughts in relation to what people are saying. But yeah, it made me think about that.
Yeah, I think one of the from the event in Chicago, something that sticks is also pretty similar, which is that we're striving to become citizens of a world yet to be born.
Oh.
And the reason why what you said reminded me of that is similar to what King says of the Empire of Eternity. And actually this past weekend, or I think it's individuals like King and Coretta, all these ordinary people who are extraordinary give us examples of the kinds of citizens that we want to be. And this past weekend, actually, I was at this like Black arts seminar, and something that brother Michael Muhammad of the October Gallery had led, and something he said was that for many Black people in this country growing up, there would be 3 portraits in their family homes, and it was of Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr., and JFK. And when Brother Michael Muhammad said that, everyone else in the room was like, yes, yes. And so, I mean, that was something new to me just growing up in this country, but it was something that was so familiar to these Black folk. And I guess the reason why I bring it up is that these individuals are so much in the conscious and minds of people. And like, yeah, what does it say that it was Jesus, MLK, and JFK Jr.? And like, what is the legacy and spirit that we're like the free school is also trying to, I guess, resonate and connect with the ordinary lives of people as well. But I just thought that was something that Brother Michael said. But the other piece was also that in the Nation of Islam, which the free school is so, connected with, he had said, which is, I was recounting the Chicago event, and he was saying, yes, like for the nation, they're trying to be the vanguard of a new world. And I was telling Doc this too, which is like for the longest time, I've struggled to understand what vanguard means. Because you've used this to say, like, the free school is a vanguard in the sense of in creating a new future that will be built upon new ideas and new relations amongst people. Because that's also what democracy means, the broadening of this vanguard of ideas and relations. But yeah, no, it's been, I think King has always been a pillar of the free school. And yeah, I'm very appreciative of just getting to learn also like what the man that he was, what matter of man he was through Coretta as well.
Emily, are there any comments for Jeremiah?
I think there are some. I'll let Nuri take over. I don't think there are that many, right, Nuri?
There are not really that many. Let's see. Okay. So there's only really one comment related to this discussion where Layat said, dang, the wrong biography is arriving in the mail today, where we double the search for the original. Thanks for the PSA. But I think it just goes to show how easily you can find one over the other, which is actually really bad. Like, because, yeah, and how misleading it is, because the whole last chunk, I think, is actually, like, it's really bad. Like, it talks about, like, I don't know, like, it makes her seem really superficial by the end. And then, yeah, I feel like that's the main comment related to the discussion.
It is not too late to return books. You don't know how many sales in books and publishing actually come back as returns. It's never too late to send your book back and get your money back if possible. But I mean, it also strikes me when I learned what I appreciate once again everybody who read this and also read the other one just to be able to compare like the true Coretta Scott King's words with like the sort of false one that I believe they're trying to prop up. And it's so interesting to me that obviously it was released in what was 2017, 2019, obviously in a very specific moment. Like, why did it have to be then? Why did it have to be put together in the way that it was? And now that I have a little experience in publishing, yes, it's certainly not unusual sometimes when somebody passes away and there's new writings or like writings that have not seen the light of day that get put together. But I think this is a whole nother level of like being disingenuous to pass off so much of this until the very end that it is like, as you're saying, like I mean, maybe I need to look at the book myself to see how they did it, but there's a way in which I think there's a purposeful masquerading almost of like Coretta's words, but actually passed through so many different filters or ideologies, repackaged for a specific time and a specific purpose to obscure the true spirit of what Coretta was, which as Emily, you were saying, it's not really about Coretta alone as so much as like the movement, and what a great lesson that would be for all people, but especially young women, to be able to have a light in a sea of like misguiding ideologies around feminism, cultural feminism, identity politics, and an inability to see the importance of sacrifice. But I also just wanted to say, like, the first thought I also had, as with so many of our reactions to getting to learn more about, I remember we it's just to be able to learn more about the like King, the man. And I think that's actually something that before Munchie's passing, he would also say, I'd be interested to learn more about these figures like Du Bois the man or King the man. And I think that I also wanted to say that I wasn't raised Christian, but there's definitely a way in which I was so struck by how Coretta described, King's life being dedicated to being able to take on the suffering of humanity. And I think it just gives me so much appreciation for our discussions of obviously the Black prophetic tradition as well, and the interpretation of Jesus as of the disinherited and of the oppressed. And to me, I think it's so like beautiful, but now so obvious. Like a man who died at 33, like crucified, and then a man who was assassinated at 39, King. Like, it's so obvious to me today, where I think before, or even like what you also understand, Christianity was not meant to be understood or used or interpreted in this fashion, but Black folk through it all, like, have done it anyways, and have been like just this basis of a huge, like this tradition that I think that we've been trying just to better understand, like, just how did it come to be, just how did it happen, because certainly Christianity was not introduced to the enslaved Black folk for this very reason, and yet something so much more beautiful has been produced, whether it is the song, but whether it's also the leaders, the people, the spirit. And I think that that's something that I just, like, now I see it so clearly. And that's also why we're also able to, I know we again are like long shot Trump and King, but there's still this way in which like when you see like a person so pushed to the edge, and also you are able to, or so marginalized, but yet has like a mission and also has to come to terms with one's, I mean, that's, I guess, maybe why so many people are asking Trump if he's ready to die, or even obviously RFK Jr., knowing that that was the fate of his father and his uncle and many other people from that generation, and also in his family, that like that gives, I mean, it's so much strength to be able to draw from Christianity, but in those, like, in this sort of like tradition that is not from the above, but certainly from below. And I think that that's something, I just don't know why I didn't see it sooner, but obviously it's not something that you would, I suppose, learn unless you really get to appreciate, like learn from the people and appreciate this tradition. So I again feel like this is really insightful and really illuminating for me.
Oh, could I just say one last thing? I'm sorry. Yeah, as what you said, I really like what you said, Kathy, about Christianity, because I feel like I didn't do a good job at this last week, and I just don't know if I'm the right person to do a good job at it, but it's just so really the parts that are so moving are also the way Coretta even gives you an insight into the life world that she and Martin come out of. And it is seeped in the Black prophetic tradition, but it's not. And I just feel like there's maybe is this idea that the Black prophetic tradition is somehow some grandiose thing, but it's actually it's almost it's humble. I don't know how to describe it, but you get it in the words where like it's so sweet when I don't know, there's something about reading about Coretta and Martin when they're younger, like because Coretta describes how they grew up like when they're 6 years old and stuff, and there's something just it's so sweet of them as children that you almost want to cry, where like when Coretta describes Martin, for example, she says when Martin was 6 years old, he would feel the spirit so much in church that he couldn't help it, but he would just bust out and sing, I want to be more and more like Jesus. And it was just so sweet, the description where Martin Luther King Jr., like he would just feel like he would be so excited in church that he would just bust out singing, like, I want to be more and more like Jesus. And the church would let him sing, and he's 6 years old, and they'd clap for him. And Coretta was like, yeah, he wouldn't stand there and absorb the applause. He would go back to his chair and sit nice and humble. And it's because, like, you know what I mean? Like that thing of like, I want to be more and more like Jesus. And then Coretta also described how she, yeah, I don't know. Coretta I find so sweet too, where she says, she like, you know, she says it so humbly or simply, where she says, somehow, I don't know why, but I always felt a strong desire to develop all of my talents, every aspect of my personality, in order to make the greatest contribution possible to society. You know, just so simple the way she says that. And it comes from where she comes from, where she saw her dad and her mom, despite the hardship, like continue on, where it's like nothing cannot be overcome. You know what I mean? And she and her sister would like walk 10 miles to school, to Lincoln. It was Lincoln High School that I talked about last week. It was named after Abraham Lincoln. It's a Reconstruction school where it's white teachers meant to teach children of slaves. Like, and yeah, she just that thing. And then she said, she was like, at Antioch College, I always felt like I couldn't do it. And she was like, I would go to this one counselor, and she was like, and then after I talked to the counselor, she was like, after I went to the counselor, I would leave that room and I would tell myself, I do have what it takes. And I don't know, there's something about that spirit that's so like sweet, and you get it from Coretta and Martin, like, and it's not just them. It's not that they're special. It's that they come from a special people, an African American people, and it's seeped, like Kathy said. I don't know if it's called Christianity, the gospel, the Black prophetic tradition, but it's this feeling of like I can do what it takes because I can do it. I don't know. There's different probably versions of it, but like I have what it takes. And that spirit of like, I want to be more and more like Jesus. Like I am the people of the book. And yeah, anyways, it was just really, yeah, I guess that's the last thing I want to say, because you do get that, like it's seeped their lives even from a young age before they've gone to Montgomery. It's just, I think, seeped with it's a certain spiritual striving. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline that with something that when we went to the nation service, I think last Sunday, I think his name is Brother Londell. I think his name is
something Londell or Lionel, maybe.
Yeah, I think it started with an L. Really, really kind man who also came to our event, and he said, "I've got every single religious book, and none of them have a spook god in them. Like they're always talking about a man, a human being, the capacity of people." And the more we study all of our anti-colonial traditions, the more you realize how steep they are in religion and spirituality, but this religion and spirituality, which is the kind that's been the most suppressed with fundamentalism, with atheism, or rationality, or whatever. But this spookism, yeah. But this is the form of religion that is actually most organic to people. And I just think it's so important. Like, yeah, I mean, it's so important to defend this idea of religion, that it's about the way people behave now. And we don't have to wait for, we're not waiting for some magical prophecy, someone to come on a horse. We're looking at what's happening now and seeing prophecy unfold. And now is the time. I think those messages are really important.
I agree with what all of y'all are saying. I want to thank you, Emily, for bringing this book to us, and, for your very meaningful presentation, and especially for your last words. You're right. There is a language of Black people. There's a spirit of Black people that is under attack. That is even under attack. One of the most important sites of Black poetry and narrative and storytelling is the Black pulpit, or it used to be. It's been profaned by letting every politician that you can find stand in pulpits. In the Black church, everyone is not permitted in the pulpit. That's a special place. And then when the pulpit has been turned over to politicians, increasingly, which is in a certain way saying that the Black prophetic tradition is no longer prophetic, it's political. And because the church does not meet the spiritual and moral needs of the Black community, Black folk have walked away from it. And those that are left behind close their doors to the people and don't want to hear the people. But you're very right. I mean, the Black church is not just filled with song, but it's filled with poetry and narrative. And King was probably the best of the great preachers. His father was a great preacher. Aretha Franklin's father was a great preacher. So people that are raised up hearing that all the time, they instinctively are predisposed to poetry and narrative. And I agree with you, Emily, and I think it is so important what you and Nuri have established, that the book written in Coretta Scott King's words is inspirational. A book written in somebody else's words is discouraging. And it says, well, you can't be what Martin Luther King or Coretta Scott King were. The best that you can be is something for yourself. And I just want to end on this. The attack upon the Black prophetic tradition comes in many forms. Of course, you had to subvert it from within the church, and it is being subverted from within the church. A lot of ways that's the experience of the free school. And I would like, and I guess some of us will find answers to some of these things in the not too distant future. But why are doors of churches closed to the free school?
Right.
Why are people who claim to be upholders of the teachings of Christ turning against young people in the free school? This is a big question mark. And they have. They have. That's one attack. The church itself attacking liberation theology, prophetic tradition. But then it comes from outside of the church. And some churches even try to incorporate this into the church, and that is celebrity culture and narcissism. King and Coretta are the exact opposite of that. And this narcissism, it's all over social media. People I know cannot get enough of showing themselves on Facebook and celebrating themselves and trying to become celebrities on Twitter and other, Instagram. This is doing tremendous psychological damage to Black people and by implication to the entire nation, because our tradition of leadership is not narcissism, as in the case, let us say, of Al Sharpton. It's a complete narcissist, a complete celebrity seeker. There is nothing that he has in common with Martin Luther King Jr. Although he's now trying to lead a march today, in fact, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. He is the last person that needs to be doing that. And of course, we talked about he's doing this and appropriating the name of Martin Luther King through Martin Luther King's son, Martin Luther King III. And, the son of a martyred person, a great person, is always not the best person to represent who that man was, sadly. But they will use this march to talk about how we must vote for Joe Biden. This is the height of moral criminality. The other thing is that, and I talk too much, but remember we talked about how Cornell gets King wrong, and he defines King as a pacifist. Remember we talked about that? Completely wrong. And it's apparent that Cornell has not read Coretta Scott King on King, that he adopted, I don't know where he gets that from. King makes it clear that he is not a pacifist. Pacifism generally means that you retreat from conflict. You retreat from responsibility in a collective sense. King ran to the struggle, not from the struggle. And to call him a pacifist is to suggest cowardliness, running from rather than to. And and I agree with everybody. And you did see it in the Trump interview. Trump is being transformed as we speak. Less of the showman thing and more of a serious understanding of the task ahead. And I agree, everybody said this, and you're right. I think Serafina, the deeper and more intense the struggle becomes, the more Trump is going to have to take on qualities and study the life of Martin Luther King. He has nowhere else to go. He cannot reinvent the wheel or make a wheel better than that was already created by the civil rights movement. And so I want to thank you for this, Emily. This has been, And it's not just me that you have, or the free school that you have impacted in this way. There are people who just listened to the free school, who felt very, very moved by what you did last week and what you and Nuri have continued to do in bringing this, as Kathy said, to young people, to young women. You know, like Coretta talked about King, what manner of man is this? We could say of her, what manner of woman is this? So it's just,
Yeah, it was really, I think well, first of all, I just want to thank Free School, because without the pressure of having to read it in time, I wouldn't have finished the autobiography. I'm not the most disciplined reader, but it was really, I think it's been really special to connect King and Coretta to our conversations in Free School around not just nonviolence last week and James Lawson, but actually the political moment, and then, as you said, Trump today and what we're seeing today. Yeah, because also something that I was talking to David about was also that something the realization King has at the end of his life of a peace economy. You know, the connection between the war on poverty and then the fight for world peace. That is something that Trump will have to take on one day. That is something that this country will have to take on. And Trump, if with Trump, will have to reach that stage of a peace economy. But yeah, I don't know. I think that was a perfect end, unless anyone would like to add anything. Okay, well, it was another great Free School with all of you, including you in the comments. Just like every week, really appreciate that you're tuning in. And I'm really excited that it seems like many people are also have purchased the 1969 version of Coretta Scott King's autobiography. But we'll see you next week. And we love you and hope you enjoy your weekends. Bye.